I've seen different videos describing the lore of Marvel Rivals, however, I'm making this video as sort of a huge all-encompassing guide and explanation of this new Marvel universe, how it differs from what we know, and just what the story of Marvel Rivals is. In this video, we've gone over every single item description, hero lore entry, lore that you could only get from the beta, and more, to assemble what I hope is the most accurate representation of just what is happening with all of these heroes and villains coming together. So sit back and enjoy. This is my first Marvel Rivals video, but if you want more like this, feel free to give the video a like and subscribe, and I hope you grab some snacks. Let's begin. Our story begins with Doctor Strange, as during another sweltering summer night on the island of Manhattan, though the sun had gone down hours earlier, the residual heat it left behind still radiated from the pavement in shimmering waves. The forecast had not called for any relief from the record temperatures in the immediate future, but the residents of Greenwich Village had come to expect the unexpected thanks to one of their more colorful neighbors. So when a powerful blast of icy air swept down Bleecker Street, it barely drew any attention, at least from those outside. Within the confines of the building marked 177A, however, someone had most certainly taken notice of the sudden chill. "We have a visitor," said Doctor Strange, barely looking up from the ancient tome in front of him. The Sorcerer Supreme was sitting cross-legged, floating a few feet in the air as he studied the arcane rituals within the sacred text. He paused for a moment before speaking again, this time with a slightly more commanding tone. "Wong, do get the door, please. We mustn't keep our guests waiting." "Wong's out on a supply run," a gruff voice replied from below. "Guess we ran out of Eye of Newt or something. How come you never told me we're expecting company, Doc?" "Because we weren't," Strange replied as he looked down at Bats, the ghostly basset hound that had recently become one of his most faithful companions. Strange unfolded his legs and gently landed on the floor of his study. "But invited or not, this is one visitor that it would be best not to turn away without at least hearing what he has to say. After all, he's traveled quite far to get here. Haven't you, Victor?" "Indeed I have, Stephen," replied the unexpected guest in an authoritative voice. There in the hallway just outside of Doctor Strange's inner sanctum stood the metal-clad monarch of Latveria, the villainous Victor Von Doom. "How the heck did he get in here?" Bat said with a low growl, the green glow from his spectral form intensifying. "This place is supposed to be intruder-proof." "It seems the good doctor's Sanctum Sanctorum is desperately in need of some more powerful protection spells," Doom replied snidely, "and perhaps a better watchdog as well." "I suppose I could use to change a few mystic locks," Strange said with a smirk, "though I scarcely have to worry about anyone getting past the front door. After all, there aren't many other mortals as adept at sorcery as you." "You flatter me, Stephen," Doom replied. "Do go on." "It's true," Strange continued. "I may be this dimension's Sorcerer Supreme, but when it comes to the mastery of the dark arts, you may very well be my equal, which makes the fact that you've come here even more concerning. If you need my help, then something must be very wrong." "Everything is wrong, Stephen," Doom said, "and it has been for far too long, but I believe I've discovered a way to fix it, to bend time itself to my whims." "Time is not something to be tampered with," Strange replied. "The cost is far too high, you know that." "But what if the reward were even greater?" Doom continued. "I'm on the verge of something magnificent, Stephen, and you hold the key to my success." "What's this chrome-plated crackpot yapping about?" Bats asked, clearly growing more impatient with every second. "Victor has long sought to undo some critical mistakes that led him down his current path," Strange said. "Doom does not make mistakes," the visitor replied sternly. "However, there were certain steps along my journey that, if retread, could lead to possibilities that currently lie beyond my grasp. Tell me, Stephen, have you not ever wished to rewind the clock?" Strange paused, looking down at his mangled hands, wondering how his life might have unfolded had he not been in the accident that forced him to go from renowned surgeon to reclusive sorcerer. But as the Ancient One had taught him, fate was not in the hands of any mortal, even those of unparalleled mystical might. "I have become who I am supposed to be, Victor," Strange said. "My journey would have ended in the same place no matter the road taken." "I wish to prove otherwise," Doom replied, "and to do so, all I require is a single spell." "The fact that you do not already have access to the spell you seek speaks volumes," Strange said, raising a curious eyebrow. "There are few arcane rites unknown to a sorcerer of your esteem." "The Darkhold." Stephen Strange shuddered at the name. The Darkhold was a cursed collection of insidious incantations said to be authored by an elder god of chaos known as Chthon. This so-called Book of Sins had a corrupting effect on those who dared to tap into its mystic malevolence. Strange had recovered this illicit text from the Dark Dimension long ago after a battle against his rival Baron Mordo, and had stored it within his Sanctum Sanctorum for safekeeping ever since. "I'm afraid that volume is off limits, old friend," Strange said resolutely. "Which one of those chthonic curses could possibly aid you in your endeavors anyway?" The vampiric verses, Doom whispered, almost as if speaking the spell's name aloud was enough to unleash its terror upon the world. Hold on, Bats interrupted. You want to turn yourself into a vampire? Ain't you already spooky enough, fella? I wish no such thing, Doom said, his patience beginning to crumble away. But Dracula and his immortal legion used this same right centuries ago to successfully cheat time. Perhaps with the proper amount of scrutiny, I can do the same and unlock the secrets of time's true nature. An interesting approach, Strange said, but one far too risky for me to allow. I'm sorry, Victor, but the answer is no. I was afraid you'd say that, old friend, Doom responded. But I will have what I seek, even must I take it from you by force. Without a moment's notice, Doom conjured up the Veil of Khonshu, sending a massive wave of darkness cascading towards Strange. Claws of Bass, Strange commanded, slashing through the oncoming wall of ebony energy with brightly glowing purple claws that were forged from spirit energy drawn directly from the Wakandan ancestral plane, Dagger. Impressive, Stephen, Doom replied, circling his arms in a frenzied motion. But can you weather the mist of Fimbulwinter? A freezing gust of wind rushed from the magical circle Doom had conjured, but Stephen Strange was not willing to back down, even as the bitter frost stiffened his cape. I've spent winters in Kamar Taj, Strange mused. This is nothing. Doom watched in surprise as Dr. Strange fought through the icy gust to cast his next incantation. Even more shockingly, each of the Sorcerer Supreme's hands seemed to be conjuring their own spells, entirely independent of each other. One blazed a bright red, while the other glistened gold. As Strange brought his hands together, he released an enchantment that even he had never summoned before, born from the combined energy of both the Crimson Cosmos and Asgard. Crimson Thorns of Yggdrasil. Long spike vines erupted forth from Strange's hands, glowing a deep scarlet as they whipped towards their intended target. Before Doom could even think to utter a defensive spell, he found himself completely ensnared by the thorny limbs, unable to move. You seem to have forgotten that I am far more powerful when within my home, Strange said. For a guy who doesn't make mistakes, Doom, Bats added, that was a pretty big one. Perhaps I was too rash in my actions, Doom responded. Release me from these shackles, Stephen, and I assure you I will depart from your home in peace. You ain't really gonna trust this guy, are you, Doc? Bats asked with a deep concern. I am, Strange replied, lowering his hands and releasing the spell's grip on Doom. Victor and I may have different goals and opinions when it comes to sorcery, but he has always been a man of his word. Indeed, Doom said as he began to walk from Strange's inner sanctum. And you also have my word, Stephen, that I will find a way to break the bonds of time, with your help or without. And you have my word, Strange warned, that should you overstep your station, the Sorcerer Supreme will do whatever it takes to stop you. Now get out of here before you find out just how bite-proof that tacky armor of yours really is, Bats yowled. No one speaks to Doom like that, mutt, Doom snarled back. You should consider yourself lucky that you're already deceased. Guess there's a first time for everything, Bats responded wryly. Before I go, Stephen, Doom said, looking back over his shoulder at Strange. A warning. I have foreseen a great evil coming to this city you call home. You may be safe within your house of truth for now, but those outside his walls will soon be drowning in darkness. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Bats barked towards the darkened hallway as Doom faded into the shadows. Easy boy, he's already gone, Strange replied. But I have an uneasy feeling that we'll find out what Victor was talking about soon enough. So, if you'll excuse me. With a simple gesture of one hand, Dr. Strange opened a sparkling portal to a hidden corner of the astral plane, one so remote that even he barely knew where it was located. With a wave of his other hand, the Darkhold flew off his bookshelf and into the rift. The extra-dimensional gateway quickly closed as soon as the ancient tome passed safely through, as if neither the portal nor the book had ever existed in the first place. For safekeeping, Strange said, almost as if reassuring himself. Doom will never find the Darkhold there. I just hope he's the only one looking for it, said Bats. You and I both, my friend, Strange mused, turning his attention back to the far less dangerous spellbook that he had been studying when his unexpected guest first arrived. As Bats curled up on the floor of Dr. Strange's study, the chill finally faded from Bleecker Street. Soon enough, the sun would rise and its heat would saturate the city. However, if only the residents of Manhattan had known how few days of light and warmth they had left. A few months later, Stephen Strange sat in front of a large circular window on the upper level of his Sanctum Sanctorum, sipping on a cup of herbal tea. It had been some time since Victor Von Doom had paid him a visit, but the confrontation, while brief, had not left his thoughts. He often found himself wondering if Doom would succeed in his quest to conquer time itself, and this day, Strange would finally have his answer. The following is a passage from the Book of Doom, marked December 6, 2024. As I have always suspected, no one cares about true freedom. No one save for doom. For millennia, humanity has caged atoms and quantum fluctuations, bound celestial bodies in gravity's waves, and locked human genes at the pinnacle of evolution. Then we claim freedom. The freedom to explore, to save, and to become gods. Yet we are loath to admit that we remain shackled by the eternity of time. So doom forged the cage for time itself. In my hands, reality became nothing than a set of building blocks. History, a thread to be woven at will. But time, that mischievous child, outfoxed me in its play. Reluctantly, doom must admit defeat. Time remains caged, yet it has found a way to reshape its prison. If it takes an entire world or countless worlds to shackle something, then does that not in essence hold its own infinite freedom? Perhaps Richards was right. This world does not belong to Doom after all. But for as long as I am able, I will make sure that it belongs to no one. And here we have another passage from the Book of Doom, December 6, 2099. Today I write words that have never been written before. Victor Von Doom is a fool. No, I do not speak of myself. This Doom remains a genius, as has he ever. For how else could he have lived to see and to conquer this future world? I speak of another Doom, one from a distant past and a distant reality, who became so brazen in his quest for power that he felt he could break the bonds of time itself. Perhaps he was unaware that I, too, was on the verge of unlocking the mysteries of the multiverse. But alas, his pathetic efforts have undone my own, and now all realities are left to pay the price for his hubris. Our dueling experiments have ignited a chronal catastrophe, a wave of destructive energy cascading across the time stream, impacting every reality in unique ways. Some collapse, some combine, others simply disappear. I dub those remaining to be the Chronoverses, as is my right. A far wiser and more experienced Doom such as myself could have become Time's master. Instead, thanks to this lesser Doom's meddling, I am left to clean up the mess left behind. Like some cosmic custodian. The indignity. Such tasks are beneath Doom. Yet perhaps there's a way that I can correct this grave miscalculation without staining my gauntlets. There are always so-called heroes in every dimension, and with the right motivation, they're easily manipulated into action. One Doom may have been a fool, but this one shall never be, now when there are so many others, eager to play the part. We see the events referenced in this passage from the Let There Be Rivals gallery card earned by completing the Season 0 Battle Pass during the Doom's Rise trailer. Here we watch as Doom tries to combine magic and science into a perfect fusion, allowing him to completely control the time stream and rewrite the multiverse. However, at the same time, another Dr. Doom in the future is doing the exact same thing, leading to a clash between the two and the creation of the time stream entanglement, a term I want you to remember because it's going to come up pretty frequently. Now this gets expanded on a bit here in this beta-only quest that we had for Galacta that you're seeing right now, basically reiterating everything we've explained about the two Dooms so far in her own words. Now, we'll get back to Galacta because she's also a pretty central figure in the game's universe, of course, given that she's a narrator after all. However, going back to the battle between both Dooms, it's at precisely the moment where this conflict begins that we pick back up on Doctor Strange, who even before the blinding flash of light filled the sky, could feel the massive disturbance rippling across the fabric of time and space itself. He didn't know where it had originated, but he had one single educated guess: Latveria. What have you done, Victor? Strange wondered aloud as the disturbance spiraled widely across the material plane. It pierced through dimensions, including the astral plane, and surged towards the Sanctum Sanctorum. Strange had only a fraction of a second to react to the oncoming wave of chronal chaos, but he knew that his next move could very well determine not only his fate, but the fate of countless universes as well. Both as a surgeon and a sorcerer, Doctor Strange had faced countless life and death choices before, but never one quite as important as this. And eventually, Strange decided that if Victor Von Doom was creating such an obvious series of disturbances, a little astral surveillance was in order. "Wong," he said, "I'll be on the astral plane for a few hours. I hope no disaster befalls the Sanctum while I'm indisposed." "I'll handle whatever comes up," Wong answered. Strange retreated to the innermost chamber of the Sanctum, near the collections of artifacts and relics from the Vishanti and other eminent magical beings. Here he felt most at home, most centered, most powerful. Here it was safest to perform an astral projection. He closed his eyes, mouthed the spell without speaking aloud, and felt his spirit lift out of his body and drift across the invisible barrier separating the material dimensions, ordinary space-time, from the endless realm of the astral plane. Strange oriented himself in this arcane dimension where things like direction and location operated on principles unknown to ordinary material existence, before beginning his astral journey towards Latveria, intending to observe Doomstot from a prudent distance. He could see Doomstot's astral presence ahead, its occult energy spreading in waves from an intense focus of magical power. Victor was up to something, that much was certain. The focus flared into a blinding sphere, casting off tendrils of astral energy as it spun. It flattened into a torus, spinning even faster, and then it tore itself apart in an explosion that hit Doctor Strange's astral self with a force that nearly shredded them into tiny pieces of paralyzed awareness. A wrenching distortion blasted through the entirety of the astral space around Strange, nearly severing his link to his mortal body back in the Sanctum Sanctorum. He locked in on that distant tug, using the anchor of his physical self to keep his protected astral form coherent as the energy tsunami scattered the other projections. For a moment, he felt the astral link stretch to its ultimate thinness, and he sensed the void that consumed all other projections as they were severed from their physical bodies. It spread around him, infinite and hungry, waiting for his astral soul to dissolve into its emptiness. No, Strange fought back. He closed his eyes and let the eye of Agamotto see for him. It showed him the shining thread of his connection to the physical world, and Strange devoted all of his power to keeping that link intact. He felt countless other Stephen Stranges overlaid on him, radiating the same emotions he felt: confusion, resolve, anger at the thought that some malevolent force had unleashed this disaster. The wave of distortion reached across timelines, across dimensions, tangling them and dissolving them into one another. Strange felt the boundaries of his mind grow porous, his soul beginning to leak away. Only the most desperate measures, only dark magic, would save him. He reached out into the void itself, tapping its negative energy and working on an enchantment forbidden to any student of the Ancient One. He would pay a price for it, but Strange knew no other way to survive. From the very material of the void, Strange called into being a tiny spear of pure psychic energy, poured himself into it, let it expand to contain him, and formed an invulnerable barrier. Against the emptiness of the void, it held firm, and Strange felt the edges of his mind knit themselves back together again. But at that time, his sensation of the other Stephen Stranges dimmed and faded away. How many of them had managed to do what he'd just done, and how many had been erased from existence? All that mattered was that the wave of distortion had passed, and Strange could still feel the link to his body. His astral self was intact, and so was the physical Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme. His astral self was still linked to his physical body, but his physical body was no longer within the Sanctum Sanctorum, and around the Sanctum Sanctorum, New York had changed. All this he could feel, even across the vast interplanar distance. Forbidden magic always exacted its price. The shock of this brought Strange to the edge of the void again, and again he drew himself back. He was Sorcerer Supreme. Earth, all Earths, depended on him, and he would meet his obligations. He would return to Earth, whichever Earth this was, and begin to restore the order that had been so cataclysmically destroyed. Now, that would mean a confrontation with Doom, possibly more than one Doom. Strange's arcane senses, attuned to the presence of other powerful magicians, picked out 2 Dooms. More? He would not be certain until he returned to the material plane, and then he would begin the work of sorting out what Doom had done and undoing it. It would be a grim task. Doom was a formidable enemy, but so was Doctor Strange. He began the enchantment to return himself to his physical body, but before he could complete it, the vision of Agamotto's eye failed him. The link to his body dimmed and was lost. New York was lost. The Sanctum Sanctorum was lost. The astral plane was just as chaotic and entangled as the material worlds it linked. All were devastated and transformed by Doom's cataclysm. How much time had passed in the aftermath of this shock? Strange didn't know. Measuring time in the astral plane was no simple task under ordinary circumstances, and these were anything but. He held himself together, remained coherent, seized his fear, and used his will to shape it into resolve. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme of Earth, was no raw initiate. He would not panic, even though centuries might have passed in the physical world and the very fabric of reality frayed the nothingness around him. Although currently the problem was not nothingness, rather too many realities, overlaid and entangled like wreckage when a great wave recedes. Each bit of that wreckage belongs somewhere, if he could but discern that pattern. Strange reached out with the senses only a magical adept possessed. Again, he began to perceive other Stephen Stranges and other Sorcerer Supremes. Some seemed familiar to him, universes where Jericho Drum or Diamond Hellstorm or his own daughter Sophia had become Sorcerer Supreme. Others were too outlandish to contemplate, cosmic jokes he passed over as if he received a direct insult from the universe itself. All the while, he tried to reestablish a connection to himself, to the New York he could sense all around him, and then a different sensation. A world unraveling under the stress of Doom's dimensional rupture, held together by a power that was not the same arcane might one received from the Vishanti or training under the Ancient One at Kamar Taj. In this world, the chaos of disillusion itself was transformed into an intricate and incredible structure, holding the world's boundaries fast against the void beyond. It was an undertaking that must drain immense power from the adept who tried to maintain it, he thought. Few could hope to begin it, and even fewer to keep it going. He touched the chaos structure, and it rang in his mind with a familiar identity behind it. Here was his chance. Strange poured all of himself into one coherent plea, not knowing how much longer he would be able to maintain his own boundaries in the vast formlessness of this entangled astral plane. She was not of this world, perhaps, but she was of a world, and no matter what, he needed to find a way back to his body. He pushed against the structure where it penetrated into the astral plane, following its contours until he had located her. Would she know him? Had too much time passed? Was the name Strange utterly forgotten? Or... "Wanda!" he cried out telepathically. "Wanda, it's Stephen Strange. I need your help." Now elsewhere, Mark Spector, in the middle of a battle, suddenly hears a voice in his head, which isn't odd. In his The Dusk of the New Moon lore entry, we hear the voice of Khonshu saying, "Come to me, my Moon Knight." The ancient voice boomed in the back of his brain, momentarily throwing him off his game. "Khonshu, I'm a bit busy," Spector replied out loud as he thrust his white boot into the face of yet another garish supervillain. "Trying to keep the Zodiac from ransacking one of your temples. You sent me here, remember? So you'll need to call back another." "Now," the voice commanded. A sudden burst of pain coursed through Spector's skull. He closed his eyes for a moment to try and clear his head, and when he opened them again, he was no longer at the heart of an epic battle between good and evil. In fact, he was nowhere. Okay, so nowhere might be a little dramatic, but it's the best that Spector can come up with to describe the blank white space between planes of reality that he had unexpectedly been transported to. A deafening silence hung in the void. For once, even the other voices in Mark Spector's head had nothing to say. For a moment, he felt as though he was the only being that existed. But he knew better. If he had been summoned here, he was well aware who had done the summoning. Mark Spector turned to see an enormous figure towering over him, draped in white Egyptian robes. Where his head should have been, instead there sat the skull of a long-beaked bird. Its empty pockets peered into Mark Spector's soul, judging him. Always judging him. "Hey Khonshu," Spector replied casually to his patron, the Egyptian god of the moon. "Fancy seeing you here." "This divine space is where I dwell," Khonshu replied, not seeing any humor in Spector's words. "It is from that I watch the realms beyond, and find those who have earned my vengeance." "Yeah," Spector chimed in, "and from here that you sit pretty while I do your dirty work in the real world." "This has been our arrangement since your untimely demise years ago," Khonshu reminded Spector, "a gruesome fate that you were spared by my intervention alone. Do you wish to alter our agreement?" "No," Spector replied, "but I'd like to finish one mission before you toss me into the next one. Maybe that's just the mercenary in me." "I have always appreciated your dedication to a task," Khonshu said, "but more pressing matters have arisen that require your special attention." Something about Khonshu seemed different. He was more confident, more powerful, less scattered than usual. It was almost like all of the fragment personas that the moon god had presented over the years were suddenly fused into one. Spector didn't know what had caused the change. He thought, it must be nice. "Fine," Spector replied, beginning to grow impatient. "Just tell me whose head I need to bust open already." Spector's unfinished encounter with the Zodiac had pushed his level of aggression to the boiling point. He didn't want to just stand there and talk anymore. He wanted to get back into the fight. Any fight. "What do you know of vampires?" Khonshu asked curiously. "That they suck," Spector responded with a chuckle, "and that Dracula owes me money." "As you know," Khonshu said, once again ignoring Spector's attempt to infuse some levity into the situation, "I have long served as a protector for travelers in the night. Vicariously through me and the other fists of Khonshu before me," Spector mumbled under his breath, "but sure, go on." "Ever since they first crawled from the darkness ages ago, vampires have imperiled my people and my purpose. And now, I've had a vision that warns of their threat becoming far more permanent. Bound by their curse to the cycle of day and night, they cannot walk in the sun, so their atrocities are limited to the hours under my watch, when the moon hangs in the sky." "So what's the problem?" Spector asked. "Is daylight savings time about to end or something?" "No," another voice answered. "Daylight itself is about to end." Spector turned to see that someone else had unexpectedly entered the divine space, an imposing figure in iron armor wrapped by a dark green cloak. Spectre instantly recognized the king of Latveria, Victor Von Doom.
"This is sacred," Khonshu yelled. "You shall not foul it with your presence. Banish him, my Moon Knight."
Yeah, Spectre said, reluctantly rushing towards Dr. Doom.
"I'm on it."
As he ran in his enemy's direction, Spectre reached into a pouch on his belt and grabbed a handful of crescent-shaped darts. He hurled them in Doom's direction, but the metal-clad monarch raised his gauntlet and deflected the projectiles as if they were no more than cheap toys.
"I did not come for a battle, Khonshu," Doom said, beginning to move his hands in a strange series of gestures. "But if you must turn your champion against me as a matter of honor, so be it."
As Doom finishes a series of hand motions, his armored fist began to glow with mystical flames, and soon 2 curved, burning blades materialized in his grip.
"The daggers of Dormammu should end this night before he even begins," Doom said, with a smirk that you could almost feel behind his faceplate.
"Good luck with that," said Spectre, as Doom swung his flaming daggers at the white-clad warrior. Spectre dodged the thrust easily at first, but it wasn't long before his reaction started to slow. He'd barely had time to recover from his battle against the Zodiac, and a 12-on-1 battle tends to take a toll on even the mightiest of heroes. Doom could see his opponent beginning to falter though. He started to attack even more relentlessly, eventually gaining the upper hand. A kick to the chest sent Moon Knight stumbling back, and raising the enchanted blades above his head, Doom thrust him down at Spectre, narrowly missing his target's body. Instead, the blades pierced through Moon Knight's cape, pinning him to the floor, one Spectre didn't even realize existed in the emptiness of the divine space.
"Enough," Khonshu said. "You have won the right to speak."
"And when Doom speaks," the victorious villain responded, casually gesturing for the mystical daggers to vanish,
"all had best listen, for he only speaks once."
Moon Knight pulled himself back to his feet, standing between Doom and Khonshu, just in case Doom had any other tricks up his iron sleeve.
"Few recall the real origin of vampires," Doom said, "but you and I know the truth, Khonshu. Their race was born from an ancient curse inscribed in the pages of Darkhold, written in the blood of Varney, the first of their kind. It was these vampiric verses that granted them immortal life, and, if my calculations are correct, which they always are, that same spell may hold the key to unlocking the very nature of time itself. I wish to study it further."
"You know not what you tamper with, foolish mortal," Khonshu warned.
"I would know full well," Doom said, "had the Sorcerer Supreme not denied me access to the Darkhold. I have good reason to believe he has stashed it away on another plane of reality for safekeeping."
"Sounds like Strange made the right choice," Spectre said.
"The last thing we need is you accidentally unleashing more vampires on the world."
"Not the world," Doom said. "All I want is a small portion of it, and that's where you come in." If Khonshu were simply to hold his beloved moon in the sky and shroud a single city in eternal night, it would allow me all the time I need to unlock the secrets of the vampires, even without access to the vampiric verses themselves.
"You're crazy," Spectre said. "That city would instantly become a nesting ground for the creatures of the night."
"Such an act would endanger countless innocents," Khonshu added.
"Please.
Since when have the gods cared about the lives of a few million measly mortals? Together, we could use the vampires however we wish, then dispose of them completely when we—"
"I will not allow this discussion to continue any further,"
Khonshu said sternly, raising a bony hand to silence Doom. "There is far more at stake here than you could ever hope to know. A coming darkness lurking among the gods, a shadow even I may not be able to defeat."
"And by I, he means me,"
Spectre mumbled. "My avatar may have lacked the skill required to remove you from this plane," Khonshu said, "but I have no such limits."
"You fool!" Doom cried out as he began to fade from the divine space. "You're making a terrible mistake. Doom will have what he wishes, one way or another."
As Doom's voice disappeared, a haunting silence returned to the empty whiteness surrounding Mark Spectre. Khonshu was still there, but for once, it seemed the God of the Moon had nothing to say.
"So what now?" Spectre finally asked.
"I must locate the Darkhold at once," Khonshu replied.
"The book of the spell that makes vampires?" Spectre asked, confused. "Isn't it better off stowed away wherever Strange had it?"
"Just as the vampiric verses created our true enemies," Khonshu said, "there is another spell within the Book of Sins, the Montesi Formula, that could take that gift away, permanently."
"So while you're cruising the astral plane looking for a lost library book," Spectre pondered, "what on earth am I going to be doing?"
"Protecting the night and delivering my vengeance," Khonshu replied, "as you always have."
"And when Doom lives up to his promise and finds a way to unleash blood-sucking hordes?"
"Then you must be ready," Khonshu said, "and so must I."
"I'm no vampire slayer," Spectre responded. "Isn't that Blade's gig? Why not call him?"
"Because the Daywalker is not my fist of vengeance," Khonshu replied defiantly, clearly angered that his own servant would dare question him. "Also, he's currently unavailable," Khonshu added quietly.
All right then, Spectre said, grinning behind his featureless mask. But those fangers are about to find out that they aren't the only ones who want blood. I expected no less. Now go, my Moon Knight, Khonshu said, his voice once again booming in Mark Spector's head. And serve me. Spectre blinked for a split second, opening eyes to discover he was no longer in the divine space. Now he was standing on a New York City rooftop. The silence was replaced by a symphony of sounds, including a scream emanating from a nearby alley. He was glad to be home. As Moon Knight leapt off the edge of the building and swung across the night sky on a grappling cable, his bright white cape billowed out behind him in the luminous light of the full moon. It must have been a glorious sight to behold, he thought, but if Khonshu and Doom were right about what's to come, Mark Spector knew his costume wouldn't stay white much longer. Now, Dr. Doom's time stream entanglement has started to rewrite and even combine different realities together, linking them all through the two Dooms, and we'll come back to discuss more of the consequences of Doom's experiment gone wrong. However, now we pick up in a different reality with Wanda the Scarlet Witch, as in her Voice from Beyond lore, we learn Wanda Maximoff meditated, her body hovering a foot off the ground and wreathed in chaos energy. She was surrounded by a low wall, beyond which the cliffs and ridges of Wundagore Mountain sloped away into the clouds below. She did this every day, opening her mind to the vast magical undercurrents of her broken world, sensing where arcane power was building, where different forms of magic clashed and threatened wider conflicts. Reality was fragile, filled with gods and monsters that would willingly destroy it to increase their own power. Wanda! She twitched, the sound of her name prickling at the bubble of meditation. Wanda had spent years honing her ability to detect the smallest fluctuations in the field of magical power woven into the fabric of reality. This was part of her task as Sorcerer Supreme of a reality that constantly tried to tear itself apart. Whenever magical adepts were active, she needed to know, not to mention, it had been quite some time since someone used her name. Wanda! The words were laced with a shadowy tinge vaguely familiar to her, but from beyond her realm. That put her on the defensive. Only dangerous magic could traverse the spaces between universes. She was the Sorcerer Supreme of this universe, and she had tasted dark magic many a time before. Her unique mastery of chaos had transformed her into a primal force of order. When the immense tides of temporal power threatened to tear this universe apart, it was Wanda who felt the surge and turned it aside, tamed it, held it in check, until it surged again, and it always did, because this universe was an entangled battleground, and she, the only one who could hold its fibers together. Since the cataclysmic disruption of space-time itself, Wanda had spent more and more time locked in an arcane clash few people in her reality could even detect. The collapse of different histories had brought mighty enemies together and unleashed vast forces. Wanda knew she was, in the end, her reality's last line of defense, the only magical force capable of keeping the conflicting time streams from ripping her world apart. If magical power were to surge unchecked, her reality would be annihilated. Wanda! The voice seemed familiar. Perhaps someone she had known, an echo of a soul long departed. Wanda! It's Stephen Strange! Stephen Strange? The sound of her voice carried in the thin mountain air, challenging the wind beyond her sanctum. Not the Stephen Strange you know. No, the Strange I knew is dead. He had been a great sorcerer, but he had fallen in the final battle of the First Demon War when hell itself spilled over into what was once Las Vegas. Wanda remembered that day with great sadness. She had led a mighty band of arcane adepts to victory, but their losses had been great. The voice, she had sensed its nature and knew it to be an astral projection, sighed. Yes, I've heard that a lot recently. What do you mean? I've tried to reach out to the Sorcerer Supremes of many different realities, Wanda. In most of those realities, I'm dead. In a few of them, other versions of me didn't believe who I was. You're the first person who's carried the conversation this far, and that's good because my world is in mortal danger and I need to be able to help it. The Stephen Strange I knew could astrally project and then return to his body as if he was flipping a coin. Usually I can too, but something about the time stream entanglement trapped me in. An entangled astral plane is the best way I can describe it. There are too many other versions of me, I can't figure out which one of them is the correct one to return to. Ah, now she understood. And you think I can? I'm sure you can. Your powers ought to be perfectly tuned to sort through the chaos of this particular astral entanglement. You're the Sorceress Supreme, aren't you? This little challenge put Wanda's guard back up. So are you in your world. Right, and I could probably figure it out through trial and error over a period of years or decades or centuries back in the material plane, but by then not even the Darkhold itself would be able to stop Dracula's machinations. It was at that moment where those names refocused Wanda's attention. She realized where she had tasted the darkness in those whispers before. The Darkhold was long gone from Wanda's reality, but she had certainly heard of it. It contained the kind of knowledge that she might be able to use. The sun had traversed Wundagor's peak and begun its plunge into the western mountains as Wanda decided to let down her guard and shift her full focus to the connection that she had established with this mystic form from another reality. And finally, she could see the astral form of Stephen Strange before her. He was a grander figure than the Strange she had known, mostly because he wore the regalia of the Sorcerer Supreme, and she made a mental note to craft garments more fitting of her station when she had the time. Most of Kamar Taj had been wiped off the face of the planet ages ago. She had salvaged what she could, but had not thought to include any ritual clothing. As she peered deeper into the astral plane, Wanda saw many other unexpected things as well. The skyline of what seemed to be New York City, but hanging upside down from the sky as if mirrored from reality. An ancient Viking longship full of lost spirits navigating a tumultuous sea of clouds in hopes of finding Valhalla. She even swore that she caught a brief glimpse of the corpse of one of the old ones she had recently defeated in an effort to protect her universe. It left her wondering exactly how close her world was linked with this ethereal dimension, but that was a question for another time. There were more immediate matters at hand. "Tell me what Dracula is up to," she said, her focus returning to Strange, "and what it has to do with the Darkhold. That book has not existed in this reality for decades, perhaps longer. You should be grateful for that. Answer my question, Strange." "About what Dracula wants? Eternal night, of course, and he's already found the means to plunge my home dimension into it." "And the Darkhold?" "The sun will always find a way to rise again. But the Darkhold contains a powerful spell that will let vampires walk in daylight and turn all humanity into their prey." Wanda could sense that Strange spoke the truth. "Wundagor is not far from Dracula's realm," she mused. "But in this world, his castle has been empty for a long time." "In my world, his castle isn't empty, but it also isn't in Transylvania anymore." "Oh, where is it?" "Central Park." Strange conjured up an astral image showing Wanda the city of New York under a full moon. Even though it was just a memory, Wanda could sense the terrible corruption pervading the city. Time had been perverted. "That moon isn't moving," she pointed out. "No. Dracula has already performed a powerful blood ritual to imprison New York in an endless night. His strength is growing, and there aren't nearly enough powerful people to resist him." "But you believe you can," she pointed out. "Ideally, yes, and I will. The resistance is going to need more help, though. The time stream entanglement has unleashed forces none of us ever even knew existed. Different histories colliding." "Yes, I've seen that." "And Chronovium complicates everything further." "Chronovium?" Strange's astral form spread its hands and swept them back together. Out of nothing, seemingly, a shimmering crystal appeared in front of Wanda. "This is what it looks like where I come from, though in your reality, it may take a different form." She held a hand out and drew the crystal towards her. "Fascinating," she breathed. "This was created by the entanglement?" "That's right. Yet another delightful side effect of Victor's tamperings." Now, we'll be coming back around to the ins and outs of Chronovium again soon, especially due to its importance in Season 0, but for now, Wanda replies, "Victor Von Doom." That was another name Wanda hadn't heard in quite some time. "How have I not noticed it until now?" she asked. "You've had a lot on your plate keeping your reality from utter annihilation. That chaos bubble of yours takes quite a bit of focus to maintain." This was true, but Wanda was still shocked something like Chronovium could permeate her world without her being aware of it. "I seem to have been meditating a little too much," she said. "It is time I took a more active role in the battles critical to the survival of my reality. I've been leaning too heavily on useful loose cannons," she said. Strange nodded. "And will you help me, Strange?" "If you help me find a way home and aid in the battle against Dracula, I'll be more than happy to bring a little something strange back to your reality." He cracked the barest hint of a smile. "And the Darkhold?" Wanda asked of great curiosity. "Where is it now?" "I stored it here in the astral plane some time ago in order to keep it out of the hands of another sorcerer who wished to use its spells for personal gain." "Ah, then you have it with you." "Not quite. It has fallen into the hands of Khonshu, the god of the moon. He's threatened to use one of the forbidden formulas offended against Dracula." "Would that be such a bad thing?" "The rite would also eliminate the countless innocent lives that have fallen under the vampire lord's sway." "I see," Wanda said. "Is there any way to win the Darkhold back? I have heard Khonshu can't resist a good game of skill." "As have I, and he's already accepted my challenge. One well-played match of chess and the book will be mine again." "Chess?" Wanda mused. "I'm surprised. I had always heard that Khonshu was far more fond of Senate." "Whatever the case, I dare not lose. The fate of all our worlds depend on it." "Then win, Stephen Strange," Wanda said. "And once you do, I will find a way to return you to your reality, Darkhold in hand." As Stephen Strange's astral form faded, Wanda let out a sigh of relief. She knew it would take every ounce of mystical might she could muster up to locate her new ally and extract him from his astral imprisonment. And even then, with her brand of chaos magic, the results might not be what either sorcerer hoped. But Wanda also knew far more about the Darkhold's sinister secrets than she had first let on. If she could possess it, delve into and master its mysteries, Wanda suspected she could at long last stop the decay of her universe. As Sorcerer Supreme, she could wield its power to destroy the forces of magical entropy and end the endless wars between gods and immortals. Surely if she helped this other Sorcerer Supreme save his world, he would see the truth and gladly return the favor. And if not, then Wanda Maximoff would have to be willing to do whatever it took to finally restore order to her reality, even if it meant unleashing a little chaos of her own. So through this, we know that Khonshu actually does end up getting his hands on the Darkhold in order to plunge New York into a perpetual state of night with the goal of drawing out Dracula and possibly using a spell to completely eradicate all vampires. And taking the opportunity to bask in the sunless cityscape, Dracula floods New York City with his vampire spawn. It's right in the middle of this chaos where we start to follow several of the characters trapped in New York, trying to fight these characters off and save the city. First off with Iron Man's Universal Rules lore entry. There are times, Tony Stark reflected, when a man just wants to be left alone to do his work. The problem before him was tricky. Dr. Doom has unraveled the boundaries between different time streams, causing them to overlap and tangle and bring him directly into conflict with a second Dr. Doom from an alternate future. This time stream entanglement had destabilized countless worlds and destroyed who knew how many dimensions that could not survive being overlaid onto another reality. Tony had the glimmer of an idea of how to build a machine that would reintegrate the timelines and hopefully restore his own personal reality to the way it had been before. A future version of T'Challa and Shuri, along with the egghead Reed Richards himself, were his main contributors, though Peter Parker and some other locals gave some insight also. If they couldn't figure out how to get Trudy running, nobody could. And that machine has been a doozy. They were going to need massive amounts of this new element Chronovium to pull the construction off. As far as the machine, the group had been referring to it as the Time Stream Reintegration Device, and because that was clumsy, they shortened it to TRD, which Tony affectionately referred to as Trudy. He was in love with the idea of Trudy, but she was a fickle mistress. Her solutions sometimes nearer and sometimes farther away as they learned more about the mechanisms of space-time and Chronovium. It didn't help that President Doom had locked down control of most satellite communications and was constantly trying to sabotage their efforts in other ways, or that Doom 2099 was also unleashing armies of Doombots, or that New York, in the midst of its own time crisis, was under the thrall of Dracula and an army of vampires, which made a casual stroll from Avengers Tower to the Baxter Building a life or death risk. Or that the vampires were always on the lookout for ways to infiltrate Avengers Tower. But on this day, as far as Tony Stark was concerned, currently he was being interrupted by an alert from one of the lower elevator shafts in Avengers Tower as a camera picked up what looked like a vampire. Contrary to popular folklore, they did show up on cameras. Maybe Dracula himself didn't, but his creations did. "Friday," he said. "Give me some better imaging." "The creature isn't moving, boss," she answered, "so there's no other angle." Below the vampire, the elevator came up into view from a lower floor. Tony understood, just a moment too late. As the elevator approached, the vampire leaped onto it and tore open the emergency exit. The elevator car passed out of camera view. "Next camera," Tony snapped. He hated party crashers. "On it, boss." Friday shifted the view. The car appeared, still going up. "What floor is it heading for?" "Looks like this floor." "That'll be a negative," Tony said. "Stop it where it—" The elevator chunked to a stop. "It's between floors 36 and 37, Friday said. Tony activated his armor. The nanotech-enabled suit built itself in seconds and came online before he could even count to 3. "One more thing, Friday," he said. "Who was on that elevator?" She named 4 techs from one of the labs studying superconducting materials on a lower floor, so now he was possibly looking at 5 vampires, depending on how long it took to turn once the people in the elevator had been bitten. That seemed to vary quite a bit from person to person. However, either way, no vampires were getting off that elevator. Iron Man walks to the elevator door. "Friday, open up." She did, and Tony stepped into the shaft. He dropped 40 floors in freefall, then hit the brakes of his jet boots so he didn't snap the elevator's cable when he landed. The sound of his boots hitting the elevator car roof rang all the way back up the shaft, but it didn't drown out the screams from inside. "Seeing 5 heat sources, boss," Friday said, "one quite a bit colder than the others." Maybe he was in luck, Tony thought. He dropped through the open hatch and took in the scene in a split second. The vampire stood casually on one corner of the car, the 4 techs cowered in the other corner. Tony, by sheer luck, had landed between them. "Mr. Stark! Mr. Stark! Mr. Stark!" One of the techs cried out in a sob of pure relief. "You're here! You're here!" "Anybody bitten?" he asked. None of the techs said anything. The vampire smiled. "All of them," it said slowly, drawing out the words. Tony lit it up with repulsors, but it was quicker than he would have expected. It anticipated his aim, even in the close quarters of the elevator car, and ducked away. Then it barreled through the victims, who screamed and fell over each other, each trying to escape the monster's clutches. Tony spun, repulsors hot, waiting for a shot that wouldn't take out one of the techs. Not all vampires turned their bite victims. He didn't know how it worked, but it was possible all of the techs would live if he could figure out how to get rid of the vampire. In that moment, it seized one of the techs and unhinged its mouth, poised to sink its fangs deep into the woman's neck flesh. She screamed and struggled, but it was much too strong for her. The vampire looked right at Tony, and in its eyes, he saw that it planned to do as much damage as it could. It would drain his tech dry in front of him if he didn't do something about it. So he took a chance. He waited until the vampire's focus wavered, just for the slightest moment as it salivated for the tech's blood. That moment of wavering focus gave him the time he needed to snap up one gauntlet and blast the vampire off her neck with a repulsor. It hit the wall, and the tech slumped to the floor. One of the other techs grabbed her and dragged her across the car as Tony stood over the stunned vampire and blasted it with both repulsors until he was sure he wouldn't have to do it again. The tech's panic breathing filled the elevator shaft, hearts pounding, counting their last moments as humans. Friday, Tony said without giving them a second look. Start the elevator again. Floor 67. The 67th floor of Stark Tower was a medical research lab. All 4 of the bitten techs were met by medical crews in full protective gear and taken to separate isolation units. The main bio researcher, Kurt Connors, met Tony at the elevator. "Doc," Tony said, "time to try out the serum." Connors had a look on his face Tony knew all too well. "Connors," Tony said, "you look like you disagree with me, but don't want to tell me that because I'm your boss. Does that sound right?" "Yes," Connors said reluctantly. "The serum isn't ready. It's not adequately tested. These 4 people are probably going to die without it, so I'd say they're willing test subjects," Tony said, but Connors was struggling, and Tony gave him credit for that. Ethically, it was a tricky proposal to give a poorly tested experimental formula to desperate people. "Ask them yourself if they're okay with it first, if it'll make you feel better," Tony added, guessing that the doctor had some previous anxieties over his own history with serums. And this appeared to mollify Dr. Connors somewhat. Okay, I will." "And Doc," Tony called as Connors headed deeper into the lab. "Yes, Mr. Stark? Keep me updated on how they recover, will you?" He was alone in the elevator on his way back up to his lab, so everything was quiet until Friday broke the silence. "Reed Richards called while you were engaged in the elevator." Doom controlled satellite communications, but Tony and Reed had figured out a way to get very short calls through using old landlines and local area networks. They didn't use it often because they didn't want anyone to find out, plus it was a little embarrassing to be some of the smartest men on planet Earth communicating via a glorified cannon string. "Oh, you should have put him through. I could have talked to him at the same time. Multitasking has always been your strong suit, sir." "That's right," Tony snorted. "Never forget when I fixed your bugs while buying out Hammer Industries." Reed Richards' face appeared on Tony's heads-up display, reminding him that he was still in his armor. He made the armor disappear, and Reed's face appeared as a thumbnail on the inside of Tony's glasses. "Tony," Reed said, "I thought you were sending the newest iteration of the chronovium compounding formulas today." I did," Tony said with the elevator reaching his floor as he got off. "It never got here," Reed said. "It's probably burying nuts somewhere, Reed," Tony said. "It'll get there." "We really can't afford to have our couriers detouring to bury nuts, Tony." Reed said more, but Tony didn't hear it because that was when the Doombots blew a bunch of holes in the wall and invaded his lab. Tony came to expect carnage constantly nowadays. Energy blasts, explosions, the usual chaos. He was armored up and powered up before all of the Doombots had landed in the lab. There were 8 of them. 7 stood near the shattered windows, their cloaks waving in the wind. The 8th held up a cage containing a small squirrel. "Stand down! Everyone stand down!" Tony held up his hands and dematerialized his suit's helmet. He had to know whether the chronovium formulas were still in that little chip that the squirrel carried around its neck with the garlic. If Doom had those formulas, he would know more about how Tony and Reed were trying to build Trudy, which would make it easier for Doom to sabotage Trudy and force Tony and Reed to change some of their plans. "Oh, you found our lost squirrel," he said. "Appreciate you bringing him back, but just so we're clear, I'm still gonna oppose you taking over the world." "Squirrels," the Doombot said in Doom's unmistakable tone of scorn. "Your methods remain as absurd and moronic as ever, Stark. I am returning this animal to you because to harm it would be beneath me." "You!" Another voice rang out in the lab. Tony looked. "Uh-oh," he thought. "You!" Squirrel Girl said as she walked into the lab, tail stiff and face grim. "You kidnapped Cyril!" Tony had to cool the situation out until he knew whether Doom had taken the information the squirrel carried. "Hey, Doreen, everything's fine. The Doombot brought Cyril back. No need to." "Tony, you know I really admire the heck out of you, but this is not the time to be talking down to me," Squirrel Girl said. She advanced across the lab and snatched the cage from the Doombot's hand. "Doom!" I know you're in there, she said, standing close to Doombot's face. If you did anything to Cyril, he'll tell me about it, and then I'm gonna come after you and you'll wish you'd never been born. Doreen, why don't you just take the squirrel? His name is Cyril! Why don't you just take Cyril and make sure he's okay? Tony caught Doreen's eye and saw that she understood what he meant. Cyril would tell her if Dr. Doom or any of the Doombots had examined his information payload. She backed away, glaring at the Doombot and then cocking her head to one side, presumably because Cyril was telling her something interesting. What's he saying? Tony asked. He says the Doombot's fed him and he wants to go finish his mission now. Doreen's eyes shone with pride. Isn't he just a little trooper? He sure is, Tony said. But now, would Doreen have told him in front of the Doombots if Doom had messed around with Cyril's payload? He thought so, but it was hard to be sure, and there was so much at stake. I know what you're doing, Stark, the Doombot said, its tone now mocking. You and Reed and your Wakandan partners. You'll be fine challengers, but in the end, your machine will not be able to stop me. Victor Von Doom will control space-time for all past and all futures. You dabble in the mysteries of Chronovium, but I created it, and I will master it, and I will bring time itself to heal. You have been warned. The Doombots backed towards the shattered windows and rocketed away into the night. Reed, did you get all that? Tony asked. The call had been open the entire time. I did. Reed's voice remained unwavering. Think it's time we reconsidered some of our research pathways. If Doom knows about the compounding formulas, sounds like it, Reed says. But didn't the squirrel say nothing happened? Tony sighed at the fact of living in a world where that sentence made sense. Yeah, he breathed. It did, but I'm not totally inclined to let our entire project depend on acorn eaters, you know? No offense, kid. There were any number of ways Doom might have accessed the data without the squirrel ever knowing. I concur, Reed said. I'll start retooling things over here. Okay, well, I'm gonna do a little math and get back to you in the morning. There's no morning here, but I'll get back to you after I get some sleep, Tony said. Try not to lose any more squirrels, Reed said as he broke the connection. Nobody lost a squirrel, Doreen retorted. Her tone was pretty heated. She'd been ready for a fight and now she hadn't had one, so all that aggression had nowhere to go. No, we didn't. Cyril's all good, Iron Man asked, and as she nodded, Iron Man responds, then how about you let him go back to the park and we'll think about how we communicate with Reed going forward. I'll do anything to help, Tony. She had that starry-eyed look she sometimes got around him. It drove Tony a little crazy, but he also found it charming, and it also made him feel good, because if he had the admiration of someone as good and pure as Doreen Green, he couldn't be such a bad person after all. Well, Doreen, we have two Victor Von Dooms with two competing ideas of how to tyrannize the future we all have to live in, and while we try to stop one or both of them, we also have to fight a vampire army. So Tony walks her to the elevators. So there's plenty for everyone to do, and this sounds really weird in my head even before I say it, but we might not be able to do it without you and your squirrels. I know, and when you get your machine built, you better remember that. So with a flick of her bushy tail, she was gone into the elevator, and Tony had a grin on his face as he surveyed the damage to his lab. Nothing that couldn't be repaired, and if Squirrel Girl was gonna make good on her threat to make Victor Von Doom wish she'd never been born, well, then that was a future we're fighting for all by itself.
You know what the worst part about vampires is, Friday? Tony asked, as he launched a barrage of short-range missiles from the cannon mounted on the shoulder of his Iron Man armor. The fact that they've taken over Manhattan thanks to an ancient curse that's thrust the entire city into a state of eternal night? The armor's AI replied matter-of-factly, well, yeah, that, Stark responded, rolling his eyes as Friday stated off the obvious yet again, but they're also a pain in my shiny metal butt when it comes to taking them down. As if to prove Tony's point, the cluster of missiles hit the ground at a nearby construction site, completely missing their intended targets, a small group of vampires that have been prowling the streets of Hell's Kitchen. Most of my targeting systems are thermal, Stark continued, and since vampires aren't technically alive, they don't generate much in the way of body heat. Do you have any idea how many missiles I've wasted since they showed up? My most recent count is 1,963, Friday said, or approximately $98 million worth of, I get it, I have to find another way. Few minor modifications to your weapons array would improve your chances and accuracy by 374.2%, Friday went on. I can project the revised schematics for your review if you wish. It'll have to wait, Stark said. For now, I'll have to do this the old-fashioned way. Iron Man swooped in front of the group of vampires and unleashed a few strong repulsor blasts from the pawns of his gauntlets, each of them missing his bloodthirsty foes by mere inches. I'm not sure that switching to manual targeting is yielding any better results, sir, Friday said, concerned. Maybe I'm not trying to hit them this time, Friday, Stark said, smiling as he continued to unleash blasts to the side of the vampires. At least not yet. The creatures of the night huddled closer and closer together to avoid the onslaught of energy bursts, and as the horde turned to flee, they'd realized that they'd been herded into a corner. That Iron Man had them exactly where he wanted them. Unibeam armor overdrive! Stark commanded. Instantly, the reactor on the center of his chest began to glow with intense power, and a concentrated beam emanated from the arc reactor, washing over the vampires. When the light faded, the horde lay defeated at Tony's iron boots. Wow, I really needed that, Stark said.
Well, I'm glad you got it out of your system, Tony, another voice interrupted over the armor's comm link, because now I need you back in the lab.
Ugh, you're such a buzzkill, Reed, Stark responded, clearly annoyed, but he knew that his fellow scientist Reed Richards, the brilliant hero and explorer known as Mr. Fantastic, was right. Ever since Dr. Doom had unraveled the boundaries between time streams, causing them to overlap and entangle with each other, countless dimensions have been destroyed, and the worlds that did survive have been thrown into complete chaos. Tony and Reed had put their big brains together to design a machine that might be able to reintegrate the timelines and restore the remaining realities to the way they had been before. But even with the help of a think tank of super geniuses, including T'Challa and Shuri from an interstellar Wakandan empire, their efforts hadn't produced any tangible results. That's because the time stream reintegration device required massive amounts of chronal power, a kind of raw time energy that could only be generated by a newly discovered element called chronovium. And until they secured enough chronovium to ensure the TRD's success, Tony wasn't about to risk doing any more damage to the fabric of time and space or to the device itself. Reed, on the other hand, didn't seem nearly as concerned.
Ben just got back from his latest recon mission, Reed said over the comm link, and he recovered something that might be of great value to us.
A lifetime supply of garlic? Tony half-joked.
No,
Reed answered dryly.
A chronovium crystal. One of the purest I've ever seen.
Then put it in a necklace and give it to Sue for your anniversary, Stark said certainly, because unless it's generating enough chronal energy to operate the time stream reintegration device at full capacity, we're not using it.
Stop being so stubborn, Tony, Reed replied. We both know that real science requires experimentation. We can't trust the TRD to fix all of the universe's problems if we haven't properly tested it first.
The way I see it, we've got one shot at this, Stark argued. We've checked the numbers. The design is flawless. This device is our golden ticket to fixing the time stream. I'm not looking to change course here, but if we rush in and wreck it, we could lose our only shot. I've had my share of luck in Vegas, but this is one gamble I'm not ready to take. Are you? Reed paused just long enough that Tony thought he might have lost his signal, but then he finally replied.
I suppose not,
Reed said, his voice tinged with disappointment.
But we can't stay in a holding pattern forever. The time will come when we have to pull the trigger, ready or not.
Take it from a guy who used to make weapons for a living, Stark said. Even when you think you're ready to pull the trigger, you never really are.
Funny, another voice responded, this one nearby. You've never had that problem.
Before, Tony had been so caught up in his conversation with Reed that he had failed to notice the arrival of another hero on the scene, the white-clad warrior known as Moon Knight. You're a little late to the party, Spectre, Stark said confidently. I already cleared out all the unwanted guests.
That's not what Khonshu told me, Moon Knight replied. He says the vamps have been using the site as a secondary nesting ground.
You're crazy, Stark said. If there were more of them here, my armor totally would've. Tony stopped, realizing his mistake. He hadn't herded the vampires into the construction site. They had herded him here. They must have somehow figured out that his armor's thermal sensors wouldn't alert him to the presence of more of their bloodthirsty kin lurking silently in the rafters above, waiting to strike.
Who's crazy now? Moon Knight asked, as dozens of vampires suddenly descended upon the two heroes.
Still you, Stark responded, blasting energy beams towards the oncoming attackers. But I guess you're not the only one now.
This whole world has lost its damn mind, said Moon Knight as he planted his staff into the ground and vaulted forward, kicking back a particularly vicious vamp. For the first time ever, Khonshu might be the only one making any sense.
You mean that moon god you're always talking to in the dark suspiciously? What's he gotta say this time?
He says that you've been focusing on the wrong problem, Moon Knight replied. You're so busy trying to save the universe that you're forgetting about saving the people in it.
So we should stop the vampires first, then fix the time stream, Stark said, furiously firing every weapon in his arsenal at the endless waves of vampires. Easy to say, but we've been trying to come up with new ways to combat the city's current crisis, as you can see. Nothing's working.
Science isn't gonna solve this, Moon Knight said, pulling a small ankh from his belt. An ancient curse calls for an ancient solution.
As Moon Knight raised the ankh over his head, it began to glow, with the shining rays of moonlight shining from the totem, sending the remaining vampires running for cover. You wouldn't happen to have another one of those things? Stark asked. Like a really, really big one, maybe?
No, Moon Knight responded, but I have something better. A plan.
I'm listening, Stark said eagerly.
There's a forbidden spell called the Montesi Formula, Moon Knight continued. Khonshu says it has the power to wipe out the vampires for good. What's the catch? Stark asked. The spell was written in the Darkhold, Moon Knight replied. And all of the pages of the Darkhold got scattered across the city when that other Wanda pulled Doctor Strange back into our dimension, Stark finished. Lovely. He knows where we can find the page we need, Moon Knight said, but there's one more thing, and a hero like you isn't gonna want to hear it. Try me, Stark said. When I say the spell can wipe vampires out for good, I mean it, Moon Knight said. That includes all the innocent New Yorkers that have fallen prey to Dracula's legion and joined their ranks. That's a lot of potential casualties, Stark said solemnly. You used to deal in war, Tony, Moon Knight said. You know better than most that casualties are just part of the equation. I'm sorry, Stark responded. The price is just too high. Never dreamed of the day where I'd hear Tony Stark say those words, Moon Knight said. Neither did I, Tony replied uncertain, and I'm not sure how long I can keep convincing myself that they're true. Khonshu's chosen avatar leapt into the air and quickly bounded from one steel girder to the next, his white cape flowing behind him. As he landed at the top of the building next to the construction site, he looked down at Stark and delivered a final offer. It's time to let magic clean up its own mess, Stark, Moon Knight said. Are you with me or not? Tony paused considering the option, but before he could answer, alarms began to blare inside of his head. No more time to talk, boss, Friday chimed in. I just picked up a massive power spike over in Central Park, and for my readings, it seems to be Asgardian in nature. Oh, did Thor finally show his fluffy blonde head? That's a negative, Friday replied, but whatever it is, it's giving off some intense mystical energy. Great, more magic, Stark said sarcastically as he powered up his boot jets and lifted into the air. Just what I needed. As they reached the level where Moon Knight was perched, Iron Man paused for a moment. Well, are you coming with me or not? That depends, Moon Knight replied. Whose side are you on? I'm on the side of whoever can end this nightmare, Stark said, and so far, that hasn't been us. Maybe it's time to change course after all. Following up on Squirrel Girl's time in New York City during the Perpetual Darkness and her lore entry Bushwhack, we find her in the middle of a conflict against Dracula, and again, I'm really wondering why I decided to do the voice for her and make her country, but here we are, so we're gonna commit to it. Let's do it. Well, that should take care of him, the unbeatable Squirrel Girl said as she stood over a group of freshly defeated attackers. Another horde of vampires down for the count. Good work, everybody. As Squirrel Girl praised her army of rodent companions for their effort, the tiny creatures began to chitter with delight. They would do anything for their human friend Doreen Green, even risk their lives against a seemingly endless throng of nocturnal nightmares that had emerged after an ancient curse trapped New York City in a state of perpetual night. You've all definitely earned a trip to Mr. Hickory's fresh roasted nut cart on the corner of 55th and... Before Squirrel Girl could finish that thought, her BFFF, best furry friend forever, Tippy Toe, scurried past her fellow squirrels and climbed right onto Doreen's shoulder. As Tippy began to chirp into Squirrel Girl's ear, Doreen's ever-present smile dropped a bit. Wait. That can't be right, Squirrel Girl said. A giant squirrel fell out of the sky? Here in Central Park? Are you sure, Tippy? Tippy Toe leapt from Squirrel Girl's shoulder and bolted back towards the heart of the park. Before she disappeared in the woods, she turned around and beckoned for her friend to come along. Yes, Mr. Hickory is gonna have to keep his nuts warm a little longer, Squirrel Girl said, shrugging as she followed Tippy Toe into the dark forest. The rest of the squirrels stayed close behind Doreen, ready to take on whatever threats might be lurking in the shadows. As soon as they reached the clearing, Squirrel Girl realized that Tippy Toe hadn't been exaggerating in the slightest. There, in the middle of a small impact crater, was the biggest squirrel Doreen had ever seen. Her furry friend surrounded the creature and stared in awe, but something was wrong. The giant rodent was hurt. Bad. Excuse me, ma'am, Squirrel Girl said cautiously. You look like you could use a friend. The enormous squirrel replied with pain in its voice. I am so far from home, yet the scent of this realm seems oddly familiar. Tell me, where have I fallen, dear child? You're on Earth, New York City to be exact, Squirrel Girl responded proudly. Whoa, hold on. Did you just talk? Indeed, the creature said, lifting its massive head to get a better look at the curious human girl with a rodent's tail. I mean, I know you can talk to me. I talk to squirrels all the time. It's one of my superpowers. But you weren't just chirping and chittering. You talked in English like a person. The squirrels of Midgard do not have the ability to speak, the mysterious rodent said. What a shame. I know, right? I'm the only one who gets to enjoy all of their stories. Guess I'm just lucky. I have a story to tell as well, the oversized squirrel said, but sadly, there is very little luck in it. Oh, Ooh, I wish I had some popcorn, Squirrel Girl said as she sat cross-legged on the ground next to her new friend, eager to learn more. Her squirrel companions gathered around and listened intently. My name is Ratatoskr, the creature began. I hail from the Golden Kingdom once known as Asgard, though my true home is in the branches of Yggdrasil, the World Tree. Asgard? Are you friends of Thor? Because I totally am. I have known the god of thunder since he was just a boy. It was my sworn duty to climb the World Tree, delivering messages across the 10 realms. It was a simple life, but one I took great pride in. I sought no glory, and I posed no threat, or so I believed. Here comes the part where Loki does something nasty, right? Squirrel Girl asked excitedly, chomping down on a handful of acorns that she had found scattered on the ground nearby. I have my qualms of the trickster for his treatment of Yggdrasil, Ratatoskr said. But according to a vision I had, I do not believe it was Loki who laid me low. In fact, it was 2 Midgardians who sought to end my days. A mortal sorcerer in a metal mask, and the Lord of Vampires himself. Yikes! The 2 must have conjured a spell to rip me from my beloved Yggdrasil, Ratatoskr said, trailing off as she considered what had occurred. And then you crashed here? Squirrel Girl finished, right in the heart of vampire territory. I bet they were planning to send an undead army to take you prisoner. But why? I mean, sure, squirrels are some of the toughest fighters ever, and it's nice to see someone finally realizing that, but there are so many other threats these jerks are up against. Aside from your obvious awesomeness, what makes you so special? My horn, Ratatoskr said, motioning to the long wooden tusk protruding from her forehead. Yeah, Squirrel Girl said. I was gonna ask about that. I just assumed you were some sort of magical squirrelicorn or something. The horn is made from a branch of Yggdrasil itself, Ratatoskr said. It is imbued with the World Tree's life-giving power. Should it pierce the Vampire King's heart, it would likely end even his eternal reign. In order to remove such a risk, they were undoubtedly seeking to remove me from play. Well, they'll have to go through us first, Squirrel Girl exclaimed, lifting her fist in the air triumphantly. Her squirrel companions all squeaked with joy, but silence quickly fell once more as the leaves around them began to rustle. Suddenly, several vampires lunged out from the woods, hissing and baring their sharp teeth as they rushed towards Ratatoskr. You know the drill, gang, Squirrel Girl shouted to her tiny squirrel friends. The squirrels jumped into action, scampering forward to meet their attackers. In a frenzy of teeth and claws, the vampires soon found themselves overpowered by the bushy-tailed battalion. Every time they managed to shake off one of the rambunctious rodents, 3 more took its place. I'd bet on buck teeth over fangs any day, Squirrel Girl cheered as her fearsome foes fled back into the darkness. But before the hairy heroes could celebrate another hard-earned victory, the next wave of vampiric villains emerged from the forest, this time nearly doubled in number. At the center of the horde stood a pale-skinned man in a pitch-black suit and a blood-red cape adorned with gold ornamentation. His commanding presence made it instantly clear that he was the one in charge, as the vampires around him eagerly awaited his orders. Stand aside, child, the vampire said to Squirrel Girl, his voice as cold as ice. This creature belongs to me. I don't know who you are, buddy, Squirrel Girl said defiantly, but Ratatoskr is with us now. You don't get to hurt her. I wouldn't dream of it, the vampire said. I have far more important plans for that mangy beast. You, however, shall not be as fortunate. So swears Dracula. Dracula? A bewildered Squirrel Girl muttered. No, it can't be. Oh, it is, Dracula responded with a grin, his fangs glistening in the light of the blood moon. And you, my dear, shall be the next to join my eternal legion. With a wave of his hand, Dracula unleashed his vampiric horde upon Squirrel Girl. She dodged and leaped as quick as she could, hoping to prevent them from sinking her sharp teeth into her flesh. Don't let them get the Ratatoskr, Squirrel Girl yelled, clearly more concerned about her newly arrived ally than about herself. Even though her rodent army vastly outnumbered the vampires, Squirrel Girl quickly realized that her forces were gravely outmatched. These were Dracula's most elite soldiers, and Doreen knew that she and her friends were in over their heads. Tippy, call in reinforcements! Squirrel Girl shouted. With a loud series of squeaks, Tippy told back and forth every animal that called Central Park home, from rats and raccoons to frogs and felines. As they skittered across the ground towards the unsuspecting vampires, another wave of animals swooped down from the skies. I didn't know you could speak bird, Tippy! Squirrel Girl exclaimed, genuinely surprised to see the large feathered flock furiously pecking at their foes. Tippy Toe shrugged with confusion. Those creatures are not of this realm, Ratatoskr said. The ravens serve Loki himself, and the crows belong to Hela.
Apparently Dracula is not the only one searching for my whereabouts.
Hey, we'll take all the help we can get, Squirrel Girl said, leaping forward to join the flurry of teeth and beaks and claws and talons. Squirrel Girl's furry friends continue to do everything in their power to distract the undead warriors from their true prey. But then, without warning, one of Doreen's beloved squirrels abruptly stopped in their tracks. Guys? Squirrel Girl said, what's going on? You're not the only one who can speak to rodents, Dracula mused. In the past, I reserved this talent for bats and rats, but I suppose it works on squirrels just as well. And I, for one, shall enjoy the irony of what is about to unfold. Tippy Toe and her fellow squirrels turned to face Squirrel Girl, their eyes glowing a sinister red. Squirrel Girl gasped in horror as she realized that Dracula had somehow pitted her best friends against her. Although she herself was not under the Vampire King's thrall, Squirrel Girl still found herself unable to move, completely paralyzed by the shock of the moment. No! Please! Please! Squirrel Girl shouted as the ravenous rodents began to descend upon her. But before the tiny terrors could devour Doreen, a powerful blast erupted from the skies, knocking the squirrels back and breaking them free from Dracula's control. Looks like you've got a rodent problem, kid, a semi-robotic voice said. Luckily for you, I happen to be on pest control duty. Iron Man descended from above and landed on one side of Squirrel Girl. On the other side, Moon Knight glided into the scene. The two heroes had arrived just in the nick of time. I'm so glad you guys are here, Squirrel Girl gushed with glee. We were trying to rescue this giant Asgardian squirrel when Dracula and his army attacked us. I don't know how, but he turned my little buddies against me. For a moment there, I really thought it was all over. It is, Iron Man said, as he blasted back a few more vampires with his repulsors, saying, we're getting you out of here, now. Now without Ratatoskr, Squirrel Girl said. Yeah, about that, Moon Knight replied, tossing a few crescent-shaped shuriken at the oncoming attackers. I don't see any giant squirrels around here. No Dracula either. And they say I'm the crazy one. Squirrel Girl looked towards the site where Ratatoskr had landed earlier and was shocked to find that her new friend had gone missing, and Moon Knight was right about Dracula's disappearance as well. She was just here, I swear, Squirrel Girl cried. Dracula must have escaped her when we weren't looking. We have to go after them. Not a chance, Iron Man said. We've barely got the means to fight off a handful of regular fingers. We're definitely not gonna face off against Dracula. Not yet, Moon Knight added, as if he knew something that others did not. But when the time comes, Iron Man continued, we're gonna need every ally we can find alive. That includes you, so come with me. Iron Man lifted into the air, grabbing Squirrel Girl under the arms and taking her with him as he said, and consider this your lucky day. Wait, no, Squirrel Girl pleaded. Not only was she abandoning Ratatoskr, but her squadron of squirrels was being left behind to fend for themselves as well. Only Tippy Toe had managed to climb aboard the Iron Man Express before it took flight. Squirrel Girl's gaze stayed fixed in the park below her until her tiny allies faded completely from sight, and with a heavy heart, she turned her attention to the blood moon hanging over her beloved city. Trust me, kid, Iron Man said as they flew together towards the safety of Avengers Tower. This is for the best. The armored Avengers seemed extremely confident about that fact, but for the first time she could remember, Squirrel Girl wasn't feeling so optimistic.
Elsewhere in New York City, Cloak and Dagger are trying to get a handle on this entire Eternal Night situation as well. In there, a brief farewell lore entry, it starts with an introduction to the characters many might not be familiar with. The back alleys of New York City have never been safe. Back when Tyrone Johnson and Tandy Bowen were just teenage runaways, they found themselves fighting to survive the cruel realities of living on the streets. When they gained their superpowers, becoming the crime-fighting duo known as Cloak and Dagger, they vowed to shed a little light and darkness on the most dangerous corners of the city so that no one else would ever have to live in that fear again. But now, fear had taken over, not just in the alleys, but across the entire island of Manhattan. Cloak and Dagger believed that Dracula, the Lord of Vampires, had come to town and that he's the one who somehow managed to lock the Big Apple in a state of eternal night, when we know that it was actually Khonshu thanks to us reviewing the rest of the lore. But it is Dracula's blood-sucking minions that are on a rampage in New York City, and there are only a few heroes left to protect the innocent citizens from being involuntarily drafted into the vampire army's ranks. Watch out, Ty, Dagger yelled. On your left. I see him, Tandy, Cloak replied, turning to face 3 vampires that were rushing toward him, their teeth bared in bloodthirsty frenzy. Cloak opened up his billowing cape, revealing the pure darkness shrouded within. Chew on this, boys, Cloak said, as 3 ebony tendrils reached out from the void and ensnared the unsuspecting vamps. They struggled to break free, but to no avail. The vampires were pulled into the portal to the Dark Force dimension that was where Cloak's body should have been. As they disappeared into a pitch black, Cloak smiled, knowing that what went in rarely came back out. You let them off easy again, Dagger said, her voice echoing in Cloak's mind. You do know vampires thrive in the dark, right?
Sorry, Cloak said, growing annoyed by Dagger's constant critiquing. Fresh out of light. Maybe if you were here, you would have finished them off like you do. But tonight's my night, remember? Yeah, Dagger replied, with a deep sadness that Cloak could feel in his own soul. How could I forget? Cloak breathed a heavy sigh. His partner wasn't the only one who was struggling with their current status quo. Shortly before the creatures of the night had seized the city, Cloak and Dagger were on a routine mission busting some smugglers on the Lower East Side when the world turned upside down, or more accurately in their case, inside out. Normally, a few petty criminals would never have stood a chance against a pair of seasoned superheroes like Cloak and Dagger, but during their fights, something strange happened. A burst of light appeared in the sky, brighter than anything Dagger had ever conjured with her own light force powers. As it washed over the city, Dagger instinctively leapt into Cloak's portal, and the two teleported away to safety, as they had done countless times before. Cloak re-emerged shortly after, safe and sound, but when he opened the folds of his cape, Dagger didn't follow. Cloak feared that his partner had become lost in the Dark Force dimension, but those fears were quickly negated when he heard Tandy's voice in his head as clear as day. She was there with him, but at the same time, she wasn't. Cloak opened himself up again, straining with all of his might as he tried to summon Dagger's physical form through the portal within him. Suddenly, beams of pure life force erupted from Cloak's body, causing him to let out an anguished scream, and where he had just stood, Dagger had taken his place, but now Cloak was gone, and yet he wasn't. If he had been thrust back into the Dark Force dimension, he could have easily navigated his way back out, but this was something else entirely. It was as if Cloak was looking at the world through Dagger's eyes. Baffled by what had happened to them, Dagger sought out the help of a trusted friend, Reed Richards, the brilliant scientist and superhero known as Mr. Fantastic. Reed told them that the bright light that they had seen in the sky was caused by a massive disruption to the fabric of space and time itself, an event that he was calling the time stream entanglement. The cosmic disturbance had cascaded across multiple dimensions, leading to all sorts of unusual effects, such as causing some alternate realities to merge together into one. He surmised that since Cloak and Dagger happened to be traveling between dimensions together when the time stream entanglement struck their reality, they themselves had somehow become entangled with one another on a molecular level. Now they seemed to exist in the same material space, and only one of them could occupy it at any given time. Curiously, even when one of them was physically absent, their consciousness remained fully present within the mind of the predominant partner though. Reed ran a number of tests in hopes of finding a solution to the duo's dilemma, but nothing seemed to work. He promised the young heroes that he wouldn't give up, but for now they would have to make the best of their new situation. Cloak mused that Dagger had always been the angel on his shoulder over the many years they had been partners. The fact that she was now literally a voice inside of his head and nothing more was going to take some time to get used to, but unfortunately even more change was on the horizon than he had initially realized. When the vampires took control of Manhattan, the heroes tried to go about business as usual. At first, Dagger wanted nothing more than to use her life force energy to heal those who had been affected by Dracula's curse. Meanwhile, Cloak wasn't nearly as forgiving to the sinister creatures that had overrun his city. But as time went by, Dagger became more aggressive in her attacks against the vampires, while Cloak had a tendency to show more mercy to the poor people who had fallen under Dracula's sway. Their traditional roles were reversing, giving Cloak reason for concern. To make matters worse, there was a rift growing between their fellow heroes as well. Reed Richards was determined to cure the city of Dracula's curse with as little collateral damage as possible. He knew that many of the vampires stalking the streets had been innocent civilians when all this began, and he wanted to do whatever it took to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. But Tony Stark and his ally Moon Knight had learned of a more permanent means of removing the vampire threat in one fell swoop. Cloak could feel that Dagger was beginning to lean more towards the extreme option, and it scared him to see her once unwavering light beginning to flicker.
Tandy,
Cloak said, finally working with the courage to confront his partner about her descent towards the darkness.
We've got to talk.
No, Dagger replied. We've got to fight. We don't have the time to worry about feelings, Ty. This is war. When are you gonna finally man up and act like it? Cloak paused, trying to keep his temper in check. He had known Tandy for so long, but it was almost like he didn't know her at all anymore. Was this his fault, he wondered? Could her shift in demeanor have been caused by prolonged exposure to the Dark Force energies that Cloak himself had barely learned to control even after all these years? Dagger's light had always been the force that guided them. What if it was finally snuffed out and he was to blame? Cloak's concerns would have to wait. He had just received a message from Reed Richards asking him to come back to the Baxter building, which the heroes had been using as a stronghold since the vampiric invasion. In a blink, Cloak teleported away. Moments later, Dagger materialized in the Baxter building. During the teleportation progress, Tandy had exerted her will and had taken control of their shared physical form for herself. Cloak was less than thrilled, but he chose to remain silent and to observe for now. "What's the deal, Reed?" Dagger asked, showing a touch of impatience. "You know we're way more help out on the streets than here in your lab, right?" "Indeed," Reed said. "You are needed on the front lines, but I think we can both agree that it would be better if there were two of you fighting this fight instead of just one." "What are you saying?" Dagger asked, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. "As you know, Tony and I have been redesigning technology that may be capable of repairing the time stream," Reed said. "This time stream reintegration device could undo the damage caused by the time stream entanglement and restore this reality and countless others to its original state." "Do you think you could do the same thing for me and Cloak?" Dagger asked, jumping straight to the point. "In theory," Reed said. "The problem is, we haven't yet located an adequate source of chronovium to power the TRD, and a failed trial run could set us back months, a risk that Tony's not willing to take." However, Reed stretched his elastic-like arm over to his workbench about 10 feet away. He grabbed hold of a small high-tech device and retracted his limb back to its normal proportions. He held up the device for Dagger and Cloak to see. "This is a portable version of the TRD that I've been tinkering with," Reed continued. "It's not capable of realigning entire realities, but perhaps it could handle recalibrating something else that had become entangled, something on a slightly smaller scale." "Tandy," Cloak said hesitantly within the mind of his partner, "I really don't want to be the guinea pig in another experiment. I think we should wait and—" "We're in," Dagger said, completely dismissing Cloak's concern. "Good," Reed said, placing a small shard of chronovium crystal into the handheld device. "Now, stay very still and try not to scream too loud. Franklin and Valeria are sleeping upstairs." As the device activated, it bathed Tandy in a crackling cascade of energy. She grimaced in pain, feeling as though she was being ripped in half, and in essence, she was. The device was extracting Cloak's molecules from her own in hopes of allowing both young heroes to live as separate beings for the first time in ages. When the energy faded, Dagger still remained, and Cloak stood by her side. "He did it!" Dagger exclaimed, wrapping her arms around her partner in glee. "Yeah, great," Cloak said, clearly less enthusiastic about the process. Part of it was because Dagger had gone against his direct wishes, but Cloak also had a deep fear that he would no longer be able to keep his partner's emerging darkness under check now that they were separated. Reed said, putting a hand to his chin as he studied the readings of his handheld TRD. "What's wrong?" Dagger asked nervously. "It worked, didn't it?" "Mostly," Reed replied, "but even though you once again exist simultaneously within the same physical plane, it seems as though your energy signatures are still deeply intertwined." "What's that mean, big brain?" Cloak asked. "It means the change might not be permanent," Reed said, dismayed. "If you were to activate the same conditions that triggered the initial molecular fusion, I'm afraid you're more than likely to revert into your shared state." "So no more teleporting then, All right, works for me," Dagger asked. But that's like my whole thing," Cloak replied. "Not anymore, partner. You can do lots of other stuff with your dark force, right? Get creative." I guess I can figure something out," Cloak said, uncertain. Reed interrupts, saying, "Well, it looks like you're gonna have to figure it out much sooner than anticipated, because Ben just reported in from his transport mission, and he says he located a cluster of vampires attacking some citizens near Battery Park." "No sweat, we'll be there," and Cloak started to say, but then he paused as Dagger shot him a dirty look. He realized that he could no longer travel between locations in split seconds via the Dark Force dimension. Can we borrow a Fantasticar?" Soon, Cloak and Dagger landed their borrowed vehicle on the southern tip of Manhattan, and the two heroes stepped out and began to scout the area for any sign of vampires. "Now this is more like it," Dagger said. "Yeah," Cloak agreed, "except for that part." Dagger looked over at where Cloak was pointing to see a horde of vampires overtaking a ferry boat dock nearby. "People must have been trying to use the ferry to get out of the city," Cloak said, "and now they've gone and got themselves trapped on board. Those vamps will eat them alive. We gotta help." "Or," Dagger said, "we could just hit the throttle, send the whole thing to Staten Island, and call it a night." Cloak looked over at Dagger in disbelief, uncertain whether his partner was joking or not. Either way, he wasn't amused. Instead of dignifying her comment with a response, he rushed towards the ferry to confront the vampires. "Keep up," he called back to Dagger. She shook her head and followed Cloak into action. When they boarded the ferry, the pair kicked into full hero mode, picking off the vampires with ease. Dagger manifested short blades of pure life force that she mercilessly thrust into the hearts of the vampires. Cloak used his dark force tendrils to grab hold of their fanged foes and hurl them overboard. As Cloak and Dagger fought side by side once more, they both began to remember how much they missed their partnership and perhaps how much they had taken it for granted. Just when they were finally starting to find their rhythm though, they reached the ferry's control room and were met by a harsh reality. Inside, there were several human passengers all huddled together. A group of vampires had them surrounded and they looked ready to eat. "I've got this," Dagger said, rushing towards the ship bridge without hesitation. "Careful, girl," Cloak said, grabbing a hold of Dagger's wrist for a moment to stop her from leaving. "You asked me? This looks like a trap." "I didn't ask you, Ty," Dagger snapped back, "and if you don't stop babying me, I won't ask you anything ever again. Now let me go. I've got people to save." Cloak released Dagger's wrist and watches his partner enter the control room. He wanted so badly to protect her, but she was her own hero, and she had to make her own choices, for better or for worse. He let out a frustrated sigh and began to follow Dagger into the bridge, but before he could enter, the heavy door that led into the room slammed shut and a vampire locked it from within. Just as Cloak had feared, the vampires had used the innocent passengers to lure the heroes in, and Dagger had taken the bait. There was no escape, no way out, except for one. "I'm coming in, Tandy," Cloak yelled, the fabric of his cape beginning to ripple in an otherworldly breeze. "No, don't do it," Dagger commanded. "I can handle this." And at first it looked as though she was right. Tandy fought for her life, hurling her light daggers at the vampires with furious speed, but there was just too many of them. Cloak could only watch in the window as horror as his partner found herself outnumbered, exhausted, and cornered along with the other terrified passengers in the bridge. "You gave it your best," Cloak said, opening his cape and tapping into the full power of the Dark Force dimension. "Now it's my turn." "You can't," Dagger yelled, desperately pushing back another hungry vampire. "Remember what Reed said." "I don't care what Reed said," Cloak snapped back. "All I care about is you." "Well, if you teleport, you're gonna lose me," Dagger responded. "And if I do nothing, I'll lose you too," Cloak said, knowing full well the gravity of the choice he was about to make. Still, Cloak teleported into the room mere moments before the vampires could sink their teeth into Dagger's flesh. He quickly wrapped his arms around her as the fabric of his cape encircled the other passengers, and in a blink, they were all gone. Moments later, Cloak appeared in the Baxter building in a flash of darkness. With him, he brought a small group of relieved strangers who had been snatched from death's door at the last second, but even though the innocent civilians had been saved, someone else had been lost along the way. Cloak looked around frantically. His heart dropped as his worst fears were confirmed. "Don't worry, Ty," Dagger's voice said inside of his head. "I'm still here, whether I like it or not." "I'd rather have you mad than dead," Cloak responded, trying not to show his joy that some part of Tandy had survived the encounter. "Then you got what you wanted." After a long pause, she added, "Thanks, I guess." "I know the darkness has taken its toll on you," Cloak said, "but I'm always going to be here to lead you through it. Just like you've always been there to guide me back to the light. That's why you and me are such a good team." "We're a lot more than that," Dagger said, her tone softening for the first time in ages. Ty wished he could look into her eyes and say what was really in his heart, but at that moment, just hearing her voice was enough. It would have to be. With that, his cloak folded in on itself and he vanished from the Baxter building. He was headed back into the night, ready to take on the forces of darkness by himself, but never alone. Just another story of how the time stream entanglement is causing chaos for everyone. Now finally, we can't discuss New York City without the most famous hero from there, so it's finally time to talk, momentarily at least, about Spider-Man. In his Unfriendly Neighborhood lore entry, it states, every week or so, Peter Parker swung uptown from his usual haunts to the Manhattan side of the Queensboro Bridge, looking across towards home. And every week, there was still no way to get there. There were too many vampires patrolling the bridge and other horrific monsters flying over it. Dracula had taken Manhattan all for himself, and he wasn't letting any of his human playthings escape. Still, Peter came by to look, wishing he could talk to Aunt May every Wednesday. That's when he missed Aunt May the most, because ever since he'd moved out of her house, he'd always try to get back to see her for lunch on Wednesdays. Today he was staying a little farther away from the bridge, watching it from the Midtown Tunnel's ventilation tower, a mile downstream past the UN headquarters. It was a quiet place for contemplation since the huge fans were no longer running. He had cased the area for vampires before letting himself have his weekly moment of regret and longing for a world before the time stream entanglement, before the vampires had taken over New York, before he had lost track of the days since he'd seen the sun. Gazing at the bridge under the dead eye of the blood moon, Peter was lost in his head, thinking about two things at once.
One, he was frustrated about not being allowed to help out on the construction of the time stream reintegration device that Reed Richards and Tony Stark have been working on. For some reason, they felt Peter would be more useful swinging through the streets and webbing up vampires as Spider-Man than contributing his own brand of scientific expertise to their little super genius think tank. Two, he was remembering where he had been the week before, about the same time, although it was hard to know what time it was when the sun never came up and the moon always hung full over the river. He had been wishing he could see Aunt May just like tonight when he noticed a twinkling in the air just in front of him. It got a little brighter and a folded piece of paper appeared out of nowhere, pinched between two fingers. The hand disappeared and the piece of paper drifted down to the rest of Peter's right knee. Huh, he thought. That didn't appear every day. He unfolded the paper and read, "Peter, the Master Weaver told me to find you and tell you that the Web of Life and Destiny needs you. I will reach out again when it is time for you to come here. That time will be soon. Spider-Zero." Spider-Zero? Master Weaver? Peter had never heard of either, nor did he have any idea what the Web of Life and Destiny might be. But this was the day he would finally find out, because as he silently gazed towards Queens, a portal popped open next to him with a young woman on the other side. "So, I'm guessing you're Spider-Zero?" Peter said. "Do you happen to have an actual real person name?" She ignored his question. "We need you, Peter. The Web of Life and Destiny needs you." "I don't..." Peter paused for a moment before saying what he really meant. "I belong here." "Spider-Man belongs everywhere," Spider-Zero responded cryptically. "Come with me and I'll show you." Peter didn't want to go through the portal. Something told him it would be hard to get back for any number of possible reasons, and he couldn't take the chance. So instead, Spider-Zero showed him the Web of Life and Destiny through the rift. The night sky beyond it blazed with portals and stars. The city below it, so far below it, was a dark splendor of neon-lit towers and shadow extending to the horizon in every direction. "See, Peter? This is your destiny," Spider-Zero said. "Our destiny. If the web fails, all spider people will disappear, including you. And not too long after that, reality comes apart. The web is what holds it all together." His gut told him to leap into action and save the universe, but in his heart, Peter knew that he had to say no, at least for now. His city needed him more. "If things get worse, you know where to find me," he said. "I'll try to come and help, but New York is my home. I belong here." Spider-Zero didn't press him further, but she did say she would be coming back. Peter didn't argue. As the portal faded away, Peter started thinking that the web might be like the model of the universe Tony Stark had talked about, with dimensions wrapped up in tight strings that vibrated through space-time and intersected, well, like a web. Peter knew a little about string theory, but the way Tony talked about space-time when he and Reed were working out the math for the TRD, that was just a bit beyond Peter's reach. He could see what it was, the same way he could see what Arthur Douglas was doing on the saxophone, but actually doing it himself was a whole other level. Peter was a bit crestfallen at having to admit this to himself, but hey, at least there's still streets to patrol and citizens to save from vampires and other creatures of the night. Could be worse. "Oh, nice, there you are," a more familiar voice called out, snapping Peter back into reality. He glanced up to see Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, rapidly approaching, fully flame on. "No more sitting here and moping about how much you miss Aunt May's wheat cakes, Petey," Johnny said. "We've got work to do." "Didn't we just defeat a deviant mutate together like an hour ago?" Peter asked. The two heroes had long been best friends and had enjoyed countless team-ups over the years, but the frequency of their joint missions together had increased exponentially since the city had fallen under the curse of never-ending night. "That's already old news," Johnny laughed. "I've incinerated at least a dozen more vamps since then, all on my lonesome, but Reed just sent me some juicy new intel that's gonna blow your mind." "Please don't let it be a vampire Galactus," Peter muttered nervously under his breath. "Way better," Johnny said with a confident smile. "Blade finally showed up." "Blade?" Peter said with a genuine surprise. The vampire hunter had been mysteriously missing in action ever since Dracula's hordes first descended upon the island of Manhattan. Peter breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that Blade's expertise in battling vampires could really help the heroes turn the tide back in their favor. It was almost too good to be true. "Squirrel Girl's crew claims to have seen him in Central Park 20 minutes ago," Johnny continued, beginning to fly towards the center of the city. "We have to find him before you know who does." Peter immediately leapt from his perch, spinning a strand of webbing and swinging after the Human Torch. Johnny was moving fast, but Peter could easily follow the trail of flame that his friend left in the air behind him. As the duo descended to the southeast corner of Central Park, they couldn't believe their eyes. There was a half-man, half-warrior vampire clad in all black, grinning as he furiously swung his swords at a group of oncoming vampires. As his sharp fangs glinted in the light of the blood moon, there was no doubt about it.
This was Blade, the legendary Daywalker, and suddenly both Peter and Johnny felt a lot more hope. "You just gonna stand there staring, boys?" Blade asked, not even looking from his foes, "or are you gonna help me take down these damn fangers?" "Oh yeah, sorry," Peter said, leaping into action, rapidly shooting a barrage of webs at the feet of the vampire horde. "I just don't think either of us expected to see you here." "You and me both," Blade mused. "Been on a secret recon mission." "Any luck?" Johnny asked. "Found a few leads," Blade said, his tone instantly becoming much more serious, "but they all sounded a bit hard to believe." "So that's the guy currently in a sword fight with vampires?" Spidey jested. Blade didn't even crack a smile, but to be fair, he didn't have much reason to. As much as Blade hated vampires, vampires have always hated Blade right back. Not only because he was constantly hunting them down and ending their immortality early, but also because they were extremely jealous of him. Blade had something that no other vampire had, the ability to survive in the sunlight. Peter worried that fact alone would make his friend Dracula's most wanted. See, even though the city was shrouded in darkness for the moment, Dracula had to know his little ploy wouldn't last forever. If he could use this opportunity to find a more permanent solution to his brood's limitations, however, a solution that was likely to be found in Blade's hybrid blood, then he wouldn't need to rely on an empire of eternal night anymore. No matter the time of day, vampires would rule the city and eventually the world. Now, as Peter pondered the chilling possibilities, he continued to web shut fang-filled mouths as swiftly as he could. Meanwhile, Johnny and Blade were busy using more lethal methods to eliminate their undead attackers. Johnny unleashed powerful bursts of superheated plasma to incinerate the vampire soldiers, while Blade effortlessly slices foes into bits with his swords. Peter tried not to throw up in his mask both from the sight and the smell, but soon the chaos subsided and the three heroes were the only men left standing. "Was that it?" Peter asked, well aware of the mistake he had just made the second the words left his lips. His spider sense immediately let him know that even greater danger lurked nearby. "There's that classic Parker luck, calm before the storm," Blade said knowingly. "Indeed," a sinister voice responded, as Dracula himself stepped out of the shadows, his blood-red cape gently swaying in the breeze. "Dracula?" Johnny exclaimed, almost excited. The Lord of the Vampires had rarely left his castle since this nightmare began. "Big mistake showing your pasty face in public, pal." The Human Torch released an enormous burst of flames in Dracula's direction, but the Vampire King dodged out of the way with uncanny speed. Peter unloaded burst after burst of webbing towards Dracula as well, but fared no better when it came to hitting his target. Their foe was far too fast. "Takes a vamp to beat a vamp," Blade said, raising both of his swords as he pushed between his new allies and lunged at Dracula. "You speak true," Dracula responded as he unsheathed his two ornate swords and met Blade in combat. "And since you're only half a vampire, it is clear who shall claim victory." Sparks flew as metal clashed. For every thrust of Blade's weapons, Dracula had a perfect counterattack that left the vampire hunter growling with frustration. Despite Blade's undeniable combat skill, Spidey could see that Daywalker was outmatched. The hunter was about to become prey if Peter didn't do something fast. "All right, get ready to light it up, Johnny," Peter said. His fantastic friend nodded, knowing what to do next. As Peter launched another bombardment of web blasts from his wristbands, Johnny produced a wall of flame directly in their path. As the dense balls of webbing passed through the flames, they instantly ignited. The burning projectiles impacted Dracula, setting his cape ablaze and distracting him for a mere moment. A moment Blade eagerly took advantage of. "Nice deal you got there, Vlad," Blade said, kicking the legendary sword of Dracula from his foe's hand. Blade quickly wrenched the smaller yet equally legendary blade from this undead king's claws. "And I shall add you to mine," Dracula snarled back. Even though he had been disarmed, Dracula still managed to dodge Blade's frenzy of attacks. While the two vampires clashed, Peter released a heavy spray of webbing at Dracula's feet, stopping him in his tracks for a moment. But just as Spidey swung in to deliver a swift kick to Dracula's pointy teeth, the vampiric villain turned himself into a black mist, freeing himself from the webs and sending Spidey soaring straight through him. "Hey Blade!" Johnny yelled. "Let's show this jerk how we like our steaks!" Blade grabbed a pair of sharp wooden spikes from his bandolier and hurled them through the air, straight at Dracula's heart. Johnny lit up the sharp stakes with two quick bursts of flame as they hurled towards their deadly destination. "Well done," Dracula said, as he used his lightning-fast reflexes to bat the burning stakes out of the sky, split seconds before they can pierce his undead flesh. "But I prefer my meat bloody." Dracula suddenly turned his attention back to Peter, leaping through the air and clutching the hero by the throat. "And you will make the perfect appetizer," Dracula growled, lifting Peter into the air with one hand. Peter squirmed to break free from the vampire's grip, but to no avail. It's at this point where Peter could feel Dracula's fingers tightening around his larynx, and for once, the amazing Spider-Man was truly speechless. His vision began to cloud with darkness as he gasped for air, and Dracula leaned in, with his fangs ready to sink into Peter's neck.
You don't want him!
said Blade, slicing Dracula from behind with his sword. Dracula loosened his hold and Peter slumped to the ground, gasping, "It's me you're after! It's me you're after!" Everything that happened after that was a blur. Peter tried to get back on his feet and get back in the game, but he quickly realized that he never stood a chance against Dracula, even with Blade and the Human Torch on his side. The Lord of the Vampires attacked Peter's friends ferociously, turning himself into a giant dragon-like bat and using a flap of his massive wings to extinguish the Human Torch's flames, knocking Johnny unconscious in the process. All Peter could do was watch helplessly as Dracula's monstrous form swooped down and grabbed Blade in his claws, lifting the vampire hunter into the air. And despite his efforts, Blade couldn't manage to break free from Dracula's grip. The hideous creature passed in front of the Blood Moon as he dragged his prey back to his castle and the unspeakable horrors that waited within. As everything faded to black, Peter wondered if maybe he should have gone through that portal after all. Here we have the explanation for why Blade isn't coming in Season 1 of Marvel Rivals, despite the fact that this season centers around Dracula, New York City, and vampires. Blade has been kidnapped by Dracula and taken away into his dark castle of horrors, so it's likely that the Fantastic Four, who we've seen popping up consistently in this section of the story, are going to be taking the fight to Dracula directly in an effort to save Blade, something that is hinted at during the Fantastic Four reveal trailer we got for this season. This leads me to believe that Blade will actually be coming in a future season, possibly Season 2, or just some time in the future even further down the line. It just can't happen until he's freed in the story, which is something that I like because of how the actual games we play go along with the plot, but more on that later. Now, in this intro section, we've described the very beginnings of this story, and all of that helps lead into Season 1 of Marvel Rivals perfectly. However, through different things in-game, we get another look at how these characters are coming together, like in the Lunar Force team-up where we see the result of Moon Knight pairing up with Cloak and Dagger. In the description it reads, "The duality of light and dark maintained by Cloak and Dagger has sparked the curiosity of several divine beings, especially Khonshu. Seeing potential in their powers, Khonshu has entrusted Moon Knight with the task of accompanying them. During one intense battle, they discovered Mark had a unique reaction to both the Light Force and Dark Force, mysteriously disappearing in a completely new magical way, and we even get a quote from Khonshu himself saying, 'Just as a new moon vanishes from sight, so shall you, my fist. For new heroes illuminate our path forward in the trials ahead.'" Much like this in Spider-Man and Squirrel Girl's team-up Esu Alumnus, we learn how Spider-Man enhances Squirrel Girl and her little buddy Tippy. As it reads, "Peter never thought he'd run into a fellow Empire State alumni among the superhero crowd, but today a class of Dr. Connors and an unexpected visit from a message-carrying squirrel sparked his creativity. Even though he didn't catch the entire lecture, he crafted pine cone-sized web bombs using his extra web fluid and handed them to the squirrel, confident these nifty gadgets would prove invaluable in a pinch, something that I'm sure eventually helped Squirrel Girl out during her battle against the vampires in New York." Now, that's not the end of the New York-based team-ups, because of course we have the Gamma Charge team-up between Doctor Strange, Iron Man, and the Hulk. However, that reminds me that we haven't really spoken about the Hulk at all yet in this massive conflict, so just where is he? Well, that answer is solved in the Hulk's lore entry Fickle Banner. Scientific inspiration, mused Banner, could come from anywhere. There were the famous stories, Newton's apple, Alexander Fleming's mold in the Petri dish, and then there were the thousands of other little revelations that would never be told because they were just part of the everyday work of scientists all over the world, like him. He had done some important work in the fields of gamma radiation, and he had also learned more about gamma radiation the hard way. Now he was trying to build both on that work and the life-changing accident. Becoming the Hulk had changed his life for better and for worse, and most of the worst projects had to do with the lack of control he had felt for years when becoming Hulk. Over time, he had gotten more control, but it was still a struggle. Eventually, Bruce had an insight. What if he can control the infusion of gamma radiation into his body? Would it be possible to decide how much of a Hulk he wanted to be? The question led to a series of experiments, and now Bruce thought he was on the verge of a real working prototype of a device that could absorb, contain, and channel gamma radiation. If so, it would be life-changing. So here he was, tinkering with the final adjustments to what he was calling the Gamma Belt. The fundamental idea of the belt was that it contained a reservoir of gamma energy that could be channeled into the wearer's body. He would never let anyone else use the belt, but if he can get it working, the transformation in Banner's life would be practically unthinkable. To have full control over the Hulk without worrying about the mindless rages that had occasionally overtaken him for decades now, Banner had always found the Hulk as much of a curse as a gift. And there were times where it was great to be a superhero, but when you woke up one morning and discovered that the Hulk had leveled a part of a city during a fight, something had to change. So now Banner was changing something. It was late at night and the desert outside of Banner's lab was quiet, save for the eerie whistle of the breeze in the spines of the saguaro cactuses. It was a strange, lonely sound, perfect to accompany the work of a strange, lonely man. He shut the window and put the belt on, testing it for fit and making sure the gamma conduits were intact and not facing out. The gamma belt was designed to channel energy into the wearer's body without letting it escape anywhere else. Banner had done this by lining the belt with conduits for the energy and insulating the conduits in every direction except a small seam where the belt was in direct contact with the wearer. In testing with the belt tightened around a mannequin, the insulation had worked. Now he was going to find out if it worked on a real person. He tightened the belt and settled it into place around his waist, then he tested the gamma detectors he placed around the lab, making sure they were active. He arranged them to pick up any stray energy released when Banner activated the belt to become the Hulk. Now, it was going to feel weird to become the Hulk that way because for so many years it had just been a sudden internal process. Now, Banner was trying to systematize it, channel it, make it not quite so vulnerable to his emotional states. In a way, putting his transformation under the control of an external object felt like losing control over it, even though the whole point of the Gamma Belt was to have better control over the Hulk, and possibly to make him stronger. You see, Banner had run the math hundreds of times, and it was possible the Gamma Belt would be able to create a stronger Hulk. What that would mean for him, Banner wasn't sure, but he was about to find out. He hadn't told anyone about the Gamma Belt, mostly because he didn't want to have a conversation about why he was building a device to do what he could already do. And the reason for avoiding that conversation was that Banner would have to admit that he wanted the belt to give him a kind of control over the Hulk that he never felt he could maintain. In other words, he didn't want to have a conversation about how he couldn't control the Hulk. Okay, he thought. Time to see if I've solved that problem. He started a video camera set into one wall of the lab and said, "Banner, Gamma Belt test. First go around with a full energy reservoir." He stepped into the center of the lab where he'd marked out a spot for the transformation. Earlier that day, he'd moved all the lab furniture and equipment away from it. Commencing, he tapped the control on the belt. Now. Lights on the belt flared to life as it poured gamma energy into the conduit encircling Bruce's waist. It's at this time where he felt the transition like he always did. Wrenching, painful, but also filling him with a sense of limitless power. Along with that came something even more important though, ease. Where Banner was nearly crippled by anxieties about how other people felt about him, Hulk didn't care about what anyone else thought. He was Hulk. Hulk looked around Banner's lab, then down at the belt around his waist. How did Banner design it so it didn't break? "Don't need the belt," Hulk grumbled, but he knew Banner had designed the experiment to help him, so Hulk reluctantly went along to do the rest of the steps Banner had planned in advance. At least they sounded like fun. First, Hulk went outside the lab, trudging down a dirt road that led into a box canyon. Banner had set up instruments along one wall of the canyon, but Hulk was supposed to stand at the other wall and clap. Banner thought he could measure Hulk's strength this way, and Hulk just wondered what the belt would do. He stood by at the canyon wall and looked at the instruments maybe 20 yards away, and it was a narrow canyon, so he took a deep breath, narrowed his eyes, and spread his arms wide. Hulk's clap usually caused a shockwave strong enough to break windows, flip cars, and send Hulk's enemies flying. But when he brought his palms together and heard the ear-shattering crack, he knew right away this clap was different. The shockwave crashed against the far canyon wall like a bomb had gone off, collapsing the wall into a rock slide that buried Banner's instruments like they were never there. Then the wave rebounded and knocked Hulk into the wall at his back, hard enough to stun him and bring thousands of tons of rock slabs crashing down on his head. Dazed, Hulk shook his head and flexed to push the rocks away, only to find that none of the rocks were actually even touching him. A glowing spear of gamma energy had surrounded him, projected from the belt. When Hulk moved, the spear moved, shifting the rockfall so he could stand, then it faded away. Hulk looked down at the belt and its reservoir was partly full. Then Hulk looked across the far wall, and one of the instruments had survived the rock slide. With its microphone stuck up between rock slabs, and attached to it was a camera. Hulk walked to the camera and pointed down to the belt. "See that?" Then he proceeded to do another strength test and see what happened. He went outside, looked up to make sure no planes were going overhead, and jumped. He peaked at a few thousand feet in the air, coming back down a short distance from his jump point with an impact that shook the windows in the lab. The arms of the saguaro cactuses waved. The belt was 2/3 full. Hulk grinned. Now he was going to try something even harder. He picked up a car parked near the lab and threw it into the air in a high arc. Before it could land, he thundered after it, leaping as it fell and smashing a fist into it before it could hit the ground. The car exploded into hundreds of pieces, its gas tank rupturing into a ball of flame that Hulk fell through back to the ground. He roared as he landed, an exultant roar that echoed out over the entire empty desert. This was something Banner hadn't thought of. Becoming the Hulk, he had essentially given off enough gamma radiation to refill the belt, which in turn had fed the new radiation back into him. The dose would have killed him if he hadn't already survived a larger dose of gamma radiation years ago. Instead, it made him, well, hulkier. He was a different Hulk, the real Hulk, the pure monster. He didn't care what Banner thought. Banner was weak. Hulk would rub Banner's face in it once and for all.
Gonna show Banner,
he growled to himself.
Show him how puny he is when Hulk gets bigger.
Hulk stomped back into the lab and looked at the camera. Inside, he felt Banner's fear and worry deep inside his mind. He bared his teeth in a grin.
See, Banner? More Gamma. More Hulk. Gonna do it again.
That's not really a good idea. It was Banner's voice.
Shut up, Banner.
No, you don't understand. If too much gamma radiation builds up, it could...
Shut up!
Hulk punctuated the roar with a double-fisted blow to the floor, coming down with all of his strength. The blast wave tore the concrete slab under the lab building to pieces and shattered equipment in every room. Sparks flew and cables tore out of the wall a moment before a row of tables smashed into the far side of the lab, breaking the window Banner had carefully shut before the beginning of the experiment. The roof started to come down, and Hulk roared as it destroyed itself over its head and shoulders. Hulk, no! Humiliating Banner felt good. Hulk wasn't done.
Watch, Banner!
He snarled, picking up a steel beam from the ceiling and smashing it to the ground, feeling bolts and fragments of concrete ricochet up the floor, right off of his invulnerable skin. Yes, he would tear the lab to the ground, and then... Banner collapsed to the floor among the smashed remains of his instruments, feeling the Hulk recede like a great tide of rage in his mind. He was breathing hard and saying no, 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 until he realized he was saying it. When he stopped, the only sound in the lab was the whistling of the cigarro spines in the night breeze. Out in the desert, pieces of the car were burning slowly down. In his hands, he held the broken remains of the gamma belt. Ricocheting fragments of the lab table had punched through his electronics, returning him instantly to his Banner state. Interesting, he said. He hadn't considered that possibility. He looked from the smashed remains of the gamma belt to the smashed remains of the lab, then out to the dirt track leading to the canyon. The remains of the car still burned at the edge of the desert. There were a lot of things he hadn't considered, so it seems like it was time for him to get back to work. Now it's here where we pick back up with the Gamma Charge team up, as in its description we learn that sometime after Bruce developed and repaired this new belt, Tony Stark watched his colleague with a mixture of hope and trepidation. If Banner's newly designed Gamma Belt could control the Hulk's rage, it could save countless lives and millions in property damage, but finding a way to infuse the radiation with magical artifacts, well... It's no longer that Stephen Strange's astral projection arrived when it did with similar intrigue. This tells us that after the chaos of the time stream entanglement, at some point Bruce Banner came to Tony with the idea of harnessing the energy in the belt in some way that could be useful. However, it was Doctor Strange, who mind you is still trapped in an astral pocket dimension, that expanded upon the idea and figured out how to harness the gamma radiation's energy into his magic enhancements, making Banner's friends far more capable than they were before the start of this giant battle. So I know this deep into all the lore and everything, this is a weird thing to hear, but now that we've covered the New York based section of the lore, we've really only touched on kind of the beginning of the giant story that is Marvel Rivals. This is kind of like the most important stuff you need to know for the, like, you know, the base level of what's happening in season 0 and season 1. But there's just so much other stuff going on, from like the intergalactic empire of Wakanda. Everything we've seen in the game ties in together in some way, and by the end of this whole journey that we're on right now to explain all this stuff, I want you guys to know every single thing there is to know about season 0, all the characters, all their lore chapters, everything. So if you've been enjoying it, please give me a like, please do all that stuff you know you're supposed to do. I'll see you guys later. It's Pineapple. Be back soon with the next part. Peace.